They were built to guide ships home. But after centuries of storms and solitude, some lights did more than save lives. They claimed them. From Scotland to the Arctic, from the Great Lakes to the far edge of the Pacific, these towers have seen fire, madness, vanishing men, and love stories tapped out in Morse. These are the stories you won't be able to turn away from. So why lighthouses were born, and why did so many lighthouse keepers go mad? There is a lighthouse no matter where it was built, no matter when. It stands on a wild and rocky coast and has been shaken by many a storm. It bears a red light revolving at intervals of 35 seconds. Many a despairing heart has been cheered, and many a homesick soul made joyous as the little red speck appeared on the horizon and told them that home was near and the dangers of the voyage almost over. That description, written more than a century ago, could apply to almost any lighthouse on Earth. Because no matter the continent, the design, or the century, all lighthouses share one purpose: to turn chaos into orientation. They are the oldest intersection between engineering, psychology, and faith. A mechanical answer to humanity's oldest fear, being lost. Before GPS, before radio, even before accurate maps, the edge of the sea was death. Up to 90% of shipwrecks in the age of sail happened within sight of land. The most dangerous part of any voyage wasn't the open ocean. It was the final approach, where invisible reefs and shifting sandbars waited just beneath the surface. That's why ancient societies from Alexandria to China began lighting coastal fires. But the first true engineered lighthouse, the pharaohs of Alexandria around 280 BCE, changed everything. It wasn't just a torch on a tower. It was a calculated optical instrument. Mirrors of polished bronze concentrated light into a single beam visible more than 30 meters offshore. It was the first time light itself was shaped into a navigational tool, and it set the blueprint for every lighthouse that followed. For almost 2,000 years, though, the problem remained the same: how to make that light stronger. The breakthrough came in 1822 when Augustin Jean Fresnel, a French physicist, invented the multi-ring lens that now defines the modern lighthouse. His idea was brutally simple: cut a thick lens into concentric rings to capture and bend far more light than a solid piece of glass ever could. A single lamp magnified through a Fresnel lens could reach 40 meters across the sea, strong enough to save ships, empires, and economies. But every revolution comes with a hidden cost. To make these enormous glass lenses, often weighing 2 tons, rotate smoothly, engineers floated them on baths of liquid mercury. The solution was elegant and efficient and toxic. What nobody realized in the 19th century was that mercury vapor seeps invisibly into the air. Lighthouse keepers, who spent hours each day cleaning, refilling, and polishing those lenses, inhaled it constantly. Over years, the metal built up in their bodies, damaging the brain and nervous system. The result looked like madness: tremors, insomnia, hallucinations, sudden rage, depression. By the late 1800s, official reports from Britain, the United States, and Australia all recorded psychological disturbance among isolated keepers. At Rottnest Island in 1896, 3 men killed themselves within the same year. In the U.S., records from the Lighthouse Service show dozens dismissed for mental instability. At Langanger Point in 1950s, a keeper drank industrial alcohol, vanished into the woods, then returned screaming and swinging an axe. For decades, these were written off as isolation psychosis, until toxicology studies in the 1980s traced the real culprit: chronic mercury exposure. But poison was only part of it. Isolation amplified everything. Many lighthouses were built on reefs that disappeared underwater for most of the day. Bell Rock in Scotland, for example, is submerged 20 hours out of 24. Keepers could be trapped for weeks without resupply. Storms turned the towers into shaking cages of stone. In that environment, the mind creates company. Footsteps in empty corridors, faces in the fog, voices echoing in the wind. Then there's the psychological paradox. Every keeper served the same mechanical cycle night after night. Polish the brass, trim the wick, record the weather, win the clockwork. 35 seconds per rotation forever. It's the purest form of monotony under pressure. A job that allows no mistake, yet offers no change. Modern studies on sensory deprivation and repetitive isolation show similar effects. The brain begins to hallucinate patterns to fill the void. The lighthouse became both workplace and laboratory for what happens when the human mind stares too long at perfection. And still, people loved the work. In interviews from the early 1900s, keepers described their lights with words usually reserved for religion. One woman, Willie Austin's daughter, at Point Fermin, California, called it a holy shrine. Another wrote, "When you live with the light, you belong to it." That devotion wasn't naive. It was survival. Believing that the light cared back was often the only way to stay sane. Even governments understood the psychological weight these towers carried. During World War II, the U.S. Navy ordered the frontal lens at Point Fermin removed after Pearl Harbor, fearing it could guide Japanese bombers to Los Angeles. In occupied France, the Germans rigged entire lighthouse networks with explosives. Across Europe and America, the light, once a symbol of safety, had become a potential weapon. Today, nearly every lighthouse on Earth has been automated. Boston Light, the last manned lighthouse in the United States, went dark in 2022, ending 3 centuries of human watchkeeping. And yet, their pull hasn't faded. We still travel to remote cliffs just to see them. We photograph them, restore them, and tell ghost stories about them. Not because we still need their light to survive, but because we need what that light represents. They expose humanity's greatest paradox, our fear of the unknown and our obsession with mastering it. Each tower is an equation carved in stone. Engineering against chaos, devotion against solitude, reason against madness. They are not just relics of maritime history. They are experiments in human nature standing at the boundary between what is known and what isn't. And to understand where that paradox began, we must return to the first lighthouse ever built. A tower so brilliant it became a wonder of the ancient world. The Lighthouse of Alexandria. The first beacon. The Nile doesn't end in Sudan. It flows north, carrying not only water but memory toward a coast where pyramids pierce the sky, temples rise like mountains, and where the ancient obsession with eternity still shapes the horizon. But there's one thing most people never realize. Ancient Egypt wasn't only about pyramids. It was also about ports, fortresses, fleets, and one light so powerful it redefined civilization itself, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. In truth, it wasn't the first lighthouse in the world, but it was by far the most spectacular. One of the oldest known examples is Phanari on the Greek island of Icaria, built in the 6th century BCE and standing only about 2.5 meters tall. In Athens, archaeologists have also uncovered remains of several small lighthouses dating back to the 5th century BCE, but none of them compared to the colossal tower that rose off the coast of Egypt. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, built in the 3rd century BCE, was the 6th wonder ever constructed, appearing some 2,800 years after the Great Pyramid of Giza. By the 3rd century BCE, Egypt was no longer ruled by native pharaohs, but by the descendants of Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies. They inherited one of the richest river valleys on Earth, but it was a civilization facing a paradox. Egypt had mastered the desert, but not the sea. Its lifeline, the Nile, flowed northward into the Mediterranean. Yet Egypt had never truly controlled that horizon. Whoever mastered the coast would command the flow of trade and therefore the future. That was Alexander's vision when in 331 BCE he rode along the north coast and chose a narrow sandbar between the sea and Lake Mariotis to found a new city. He called it Alexandria, a port that would connect Greece, Africa, and Asia in a single network of knowledge and commerce. The choice was genius and almost reckless. Alexandria lay between two worlds, the salt water of the Mediterranean and the fresh water of the Nile Delta. Channels would need to be dug, harbors dredged, walls raised against both desert wind and storm surge. Yet, if it worked, the city could anchor the ancient world's busiest maritime corridor. Within a century, it did. By 300 BCE, Alexandria had become the largest city west of Babylon, a metropolis of marble colonnades, straight boulevards, and a harbor so vast it swallowed entire fleets. The city's design was radical for its time. A grid plan drawn by Denoise of Rhodes, Alexander's chief architect centuries before modern urbanism. The main avenue, Canopic Way, stretched 5 kilometers from east to west, wide enough for 8 horse-drawn chariots to race side by side. Beneath the streets ran a system of stone sewers and aqueducts fed by channels from the Nile, one of the earliest integrated sanitation networks ever built. At the city's heart rose the Palace Quarter, overlooking twin harbors. The Great Harbor to the east and Ionostos Harbor to the west. The island of Faroes sat at the mouth of that eastern basin, forming a natural breakwater, a causeway known as the Heptadian, 7 stadia long, roughly 1.3 kilometers, linked the island to the mainland, splitting the waters into 2 great ports and turning Alexandria into the nerve center of the Mediterranean. On the mainland stood the Library of Alexandria and the Maon, the first true research institute in history. Here scholars from Greece, Babylon, and Egypt lived on stipends, studied geometry, anatomy, astronomy, and geography. They weren't priests or court scribes. They were the first scientists in the modern sense. The Rosens measured the Earth's circumference, here with astonishing accuracy. Hero of Alexandria built the first steam-powered device. Euclid wrote the elements within its walls. Alexandria wasn't a city of superstition. It was a laboratory of precision. And like all laboratories, it needed instruments. Yet for all its brilliance, the city's location made it dangerous. The seabed outside the Great Harbor was a trap of sandbars and reefs. Without modern charts, ships entering from the Iron could be dashed to splinters within sight of land. The very geography that made Alexandria great also threatened to destroy it. To tame that risk, Tommy II Philadelphia, Alexander's successor, conceived an audacious plan. He would build a beacon so tall it could be seen far beyond the horizon, day or night. Not a temple, not a pyramid, but a tower of light. It would rise from the island of Pharos itself, guarding the harbor entrance, its fire blazing as a symbol of both safety and power. This wasn't just engineering. It was empire. Step through the brine of Alexandria's eastern harbor and imagine the lighthouse still whole. From nautical miles away, Mediterranean sailors could pick out a huge white limestone tower blazing in the Egyptian sun. Closer in, its immensity hit home. A structure more than 100 meters tall over a modern 30-story building soaring from the island of Pharos. It didn't just guide you, it humbled you. Many sources describe the lighthouse as 3 stacked zones. The first tier square and plan formed a massive base, a giant stone cube facing the 4 winds. It was the tallest of the 3, nearly half the total height. Centered on the harbor-facing side was an enormous entrance. Recently salvaged blocks show the door frame was granite from Aswan with a lintel over 12 meters long. Set within that stone frame once stood a colossal wooden door tens of meters high, weighing hundreds of tons when fully assembled. It wasn't merely a threshold. It was a proclamation. Whoever comes to Alexandria, know you've reached the center of the world. The second tier narrowed into an octagon. This transition reduced weight on the square base and trimmed the wind load off the sea. Walls up to 2 meters. Thick held a cadence of windows and vents, letting the tower breathe and shedding pressure. This may also have housed guards and technicians, those who kept the summit fire alive. The third tier, the crown, was a smaller cylindrical tower where the flame burned, fed day and night with wood, oil, and perhaps resin. The beacon was long said to be amplified by polished metal mirrors, projecting its signal for dozens of miles. Modern science suggests the real secret was the tower's height. At more than 100 meters, its horizon distance alone added tens of kilometers of visibility. Stand at the base and you'd feel tiny. Ramps or a spiral stair within lifted labor crews upward with fuel. Low, thick-walled, windowless rooms served as storage for wood, oil, and grain. Footsteps rang off stone. Wind moaned through vents. Smoke and resin scented the air. The Pharos' interior, as haunting as its exterior, was grand. As for dimensions, medieval reports vary. The 12th century Spanish traveler Al-Balawi put the height near 300 cubits, about 140 meters if you pick a larger cubit. But modern analysis favors 110 meters. Ibn Battuta famously noted walls 10 spans thick. When archaeologists compared that with actual salvaged blocks, the numbers lined up. His span became ground truth that helps lock in the scale. At over 100 meters, the Pharos was one of the tallest works of the ancient world, second only to the Great Pyramid. But unlike the pyramid, a house for the dead, the Lighthouse was a living organism, always active, always lit, always staffed. A wonder of construction, yes, but also a wonder of logistics and operations. A striking correction. The Pharos' walls were essentially straight, not sloped like a pyramid. Many older illustrations show a tapering face, likely influenced by pyramid iconography, but corner blocks recovered from the harbor indicate vertical elevations, giving the tower a sterner, more imposing profile. Materially, the lighthouse combined white limestone, Egypt's staple, with Awan granite and critical elements like door frames and bases. Giant blocks, some over 12 meters long, weighing tens of tons, were fed up the Nile on barges and through canals to Alexandria. That feat demanded not only brute labor, but state-level planning and coordination. Now imagine a night in the 3rd century BCE offshore. Waves slap a hull. From afar, sailors fix on a mammoth flame at the crown of the tower. Its light streaks across the Black Sea, a colossal eye watching over them. For sailors, it's hope, a promise of safe harbor. For merchants, an invitation to a booming metropolis. For soldiers, a warning they're entering the domain of a mighty state. The Pharos was architecture and politics. Ptolemy II, Alexander's successor in Egypt, meant to prove Alexandria lacked nothing compared to Athens or Babylon, and might surpass both. The lighthouse was erected to show the world the strength of a new capital, a seat not just of Egypt, but of a rising Mediterranean civilization. It paired with the Library of Alexandria, the other icon of intellect. If the library stored humankind's mind, the lighthouse was its guiding light. One was the light of knowledge, the other the light that carried it across the sea. Together, they forged Alexandria's identity, a city of light and understanding. And yet, no wonder lasts forever. After more than 1,000 years of burning over the Mediterranean, the Pharos entered its long twilight. Perched on a delicate strip between sea and river, Alexandria was always Quaker. The first tremors struck in the 10th century. The death blows came with the great quakes of 1303 and 1323. In those disasters, the tower fractured. Massive stones tumbled into the sea. By the 14th century, the lighthouse had vanished from the skyline. People in Alexandria saw only piles of broken blocks along the shore. Later dynasties recycled them. In 1477, the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay raised a fortress right where the pharaohs had stood, building with the lighthouse's own granite and limestone. Qaitbay Fort still stands, new armor draped over the pharaohs' bones, accidentally preserving the true site of the lost wonder. For centuries afterward, the world mostly forgot the lighthouse. Scholars argued over conflicting medieval drawings and travelogues. Some sketches turned it into a many-doored Tower of Babylon. Others made it look like a European keep. No one really knew what the pharaohs had looked like. Not until the late 20th century did the mystery begin to clear. In 1994, a French team working with Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities dived the eastern harbor. What they found stunned the world. Thousands of gigantic stones strewn across tens of thousands of square meters of seabed. Many were over 12 meters long, weighing tens of tons. Clearly not natural. Mixed among them, statue bases, columns, wall segments, the parts of a once titanic structure. Divers tell of the surreal moment when their lamps swept over granite shapes half buried in sand and weed. These were stones that once lifted a light that ruled the sea. Now they lay silent in darkness. The hush underwater felt as dense as a sealed chapter of history waiting to be opened. Modern tech became the key. Instead of sketching by hand, archaeologists use photogrammetry, tens of thousands of images from all angles to create precise 3D maps. On screen, the sea drained away, and the entire stone field resolved like a giant scale model. Granite blocks ceased being chaos. They began to click into place as pieces of a tower that once stood against the sky. One of the most important finds, doorframe blocks. When assembled digitally, grooves for hinge fittings emerged, proving there had been a truly colossal wooden door. That entrance stretched up to 12 meters and weighed over 200 tons. One of the grandest portals of the ancient world, that it was Alexandria's hello to every ship that entered. A statement that they were crossing into a city of wonders. Other corner elements showed vertical walls, not the sloping faces popular art had long imagined. This was the first physical confirmation of the pharaohs' true geometry, forcing scholars to rewrite long-held assumptions. The lighthouse hadn't mimicked pyramids. It was a crisp, modern-looking tower, more severe than we pictured. While mapping the harbor, researchers also found hundreds of carved blocks, bases, columns, sculpted fragments. Many are displayed today in Alexandria's underwater museum. But the 3D data is the greatest treasure. It lets us rebuild the lighthouse virtually. On screen, the Mediterranean ease away. Water sinks, and what lay hidden for 6 centuries rises into digital light. From that data, the pharaohs' profile sharpens. A 3-tier tower, vertical walls, an immense portal, interior service rooms, a roaring fire at the crown. No longer legend or guesswork. This is a reconstruction grounded in archaeology and measurement. Reassembling the past is never simple. Archaeologists call it a 30,000-piece puzzle with many missing pieces. Some blocks were salvaged in the 19th century and sit in museums. Others lie shattered under the sea. But piece by stubborn piece, they're bringing the picture back. Marrying 3D modeling to ancient texts yields a height of 100 by 110 meters, about a 2-story building, placing the pharaohs among the tallest works of the ancient world. Not merely worthy of the 7 wonders, it stands shoulder to shoulder with humanity's great symbolic structures. The pharaohs was a manifesto of light, but ancient Egypt didn't stop there. Drain Lake Nasser and a chain of megaforts emerges. Sift the sands at Abydos, 6 miles from the Nile, and Another secret appears: an ancient fleet buried in the earth for more than 5,000 years. Along the southern frontier on the old edge with Nubia, archaeologists have recorded the remains of 15 vast fortresses, built around 1850 BC in the Middle Kingdom. Picture the Nile's bank then. Not a calm green strip, but a queue of colossal strongholds stretching for more than 200 meters, walls 36 feet high. Thick ramparts, dry mows, towers, arrow loops with sweeping arcs. Everything you expect in a 12th century European castle existed here 3 millennia earlier. Among them, Bowen stands out. Its perimeter nearly 1.5 kilometers, capable of housing thousands. It wasn't just a fort. It was a sealed military city. Barracks, granaries, command posts. Records suggest the whole chain could host up to 10,000 soldiers, a staggering force for its time. And yet, the puzzle, there's almost no evidence of major battles here. The archaeological layers don't show heavy slaughter, prolonged sieges, or widespread destruction. The forts were built, manned, maintained, and then barely fought. So, what were they really for? One clue comes from surviving inscriptions. In one, a pharaoh boasts of pushing the boundary farther than my fathers, subduing the Kushites, taking their lands, stealing their grain, slaughtering their herds. But when you map the system, the forts don't just sit on conflict lines. They hug trade corridors. Inside, archaeologists found enormous grain silos far beyond garrison needs. That points to a powerful hypothesis. The forts were not only shields, they were custom houses, especially for gold from Nubia. Egypt needed gold to fashion jewelry, to sheath coffins to honor the gods. Nubia was the mother lode. Controlling the river routes meant controlling the economy's lifeblood. The forts functioned as the ancient world's Fort Knox, projecting military might while ensuring not a grain of gold slipped past the pharaoh's grasp. If the pharaoh's was the bright badge that told the world Alexandria's name, the southern forts were the wall of shadow, declaring Egypt's grip on the south and its treasures. Ironically, they were so effective as deterrents and choke points that almost no pitched battles ever needed to be fought. But Egypt's secrets aren't confined to walls. Some lie in the sand far from the river. At Abydos, one of Egypt's holiest landscapes, archaeologists uncovered an astonishing sight. 14 wooden boats up to 60 feet long, buried in parallel 6 miles from the Nile. No river ever ran there. No evidence of a harbor exists. They lay in the desert, sealed in mud brick casings plastered white that would have gleamed in the sun when new. These were not reed craft or crude dugouts. They were plank-willed hulls stitched together with rope. The cutting-edge naval tech of 5,000 years ago, each capable of carrying 30 oarmen. They were ceremonial ships, emblems of power. To bury an entire fleet like that, only a pharaoh could command the resources. Why enter them in the desert? The answer is religious. Abydos is bound to Osiris, god of death and rebirth. Early Egyptian kings chose to be honored here, and the boats became soul ships, vehicles to carry the pharaoh on his posthumous voyage. They were the conveyances by which he rode the celestial Nile toward eternity. Crucially, the Abydos boats date to around 2700 BCE, 200 years before Khufu's pyramid and more than a millennium before Tutan's tomb. In a real sense, this was the proto-Valley of the Kings, the first landscape where resurrection was engineered in wood and brick. When modern surveys drained the sand, they show not just the fleet, but an entire royal cemetery below. Brick enclosures, walls, steely. Proof that this plateau was an early religious capital where ideas of death and return took shape. From Abydos, that belief flowed down the Nile, eventually crystallizing into pyramids, the later Valley of the Kings, and 1,000 horary rites. Taken together, the 3 mysteries, the pharaohs, the forts, and the Abydos fleet fit like tesserae in a single mosaic. Egypt is not only the land of pyramids. It is the land of a lighthouse's light, of a gigantic frontier wall, and of boats buried in the desert. All reflect one deep obsession: how to assert power, manage life, and defy death. As the sun sets over Alexandria, the shadow of Kite Bay Fort stretches across the sea. And beneath Abydos's hot sands, the boats lie still. We've only begun to turn the first pages of a buried book. And with every discovery, the same question grows louder. How many secrets are still waiting to be solved? The first beacon of humanity rose from the calm Mediterranean, a tower of science, empire, and light. But 2,000 years later, on the far edge of another ocean, mankind would try again. This time, not to glorify civilization, but to survive it, and the sea would fight back. The brutality of Tillamook Rock Lighthouse. Terrible till dawn by early January of 1881, the work was almost done. On a black, windswept night off the coast of Oregon, the unfinished lighthouse stood like a dark tooth of stone rising from the sea spray and fog. The men inside, builders, not yet keepers, were huddled in their barracks, exhausted after a day of dangerous labor. They had been fighting not against deadlines or bureaucrats, but against the Pacific itself. The superintendent, H.S. Wheeler, listened as the storm grew heavier, its roar turning the air itself into a living thing. Then, beneath the crash of wind and surf, he heard another sound. Human voices, shouts of panic, faint and distant, but unmistakable. He stepped outside into the freezing rain, scanning the darkness. Somewhere out there through the gale, a ship was in trouble. There was no time to think. Wheeler shouted for his men. They rushed up the narrow stairs of the unfinished tower, hauling lanterns and scraps of oil-soaked rags. In the chamber, where the great frontal lens waited to be assembled, they lit what light they could. Below, others built signal fires, their flames beaten flat by the wind, but still visible between the waves. It was not much, just a trembling glow through the fog, but it was all they had. For a brief moment they saw it, a faint glimmer far out in the storm, the running lights of a ship. Then the glow vanished, swallowed by black water when morning came. The sea had gone still again, eerily calm, as if exhausted by its own fury. Floating among the kelp and foam were timbers, barrels, torn planks, and bodies. The ship was the British bark Lupasha, 1,300 tons, bound from Japan to Portland. Her captain, B.H. Raven, had taken command after his brother, Captain Irvin Raven, died on a previous voyage, somewhere near the Columbia River. Heavy fog and westerly winds had driven the vessel dangerously close to shore. Some believed her compass had failed. Whatever the cause, she never found the channel. No one knew whether the crew had seen the feeble lanterns burning on the rock or the desperate fires Wheeler's men had lit in the storm. Either way, the sea decided. All 16 men aboard the Lupasha were lost. 12 bodies washed up on shore. 4 were never found. But from the wreckage came one survivor, a young Australian shepherd, half drowned, trembling, alive. The men who found him named him Lupasha's dog. For the builders on Tillamook Rock, the sight of that wreck changed everything. The tower had been a project, a contract, a line item on a federal list. After that night, it became a mission. The lighthouse had come too late to save the men of the Lupasha, but it would not come too late for others. The name Terrible Tilly would not be spoken until later. But in that dawn, as Wheeler and his men looked down on the wreckage drifting around the base of the rock, they understood what this place demanded of them. It was not just a light they were building, it was defiance cast in stone, lit by fire, and paid for in blood. The wreck of the Lupasha was not an accident. It was a symptom. For decades, ships had been dying on that same stretch of water, shattered on reefs, swallowed by shifting sandbars, erased by fog and wind, long before any lighthouse could warn them. This was the mouth of the Columbia River, the most dangerous river entrance on the Pacific coast of North America. From the air, it looks almost peaceful. 3 meters wide, 6 miles long, a great river meeting the open ocean. But beneath the surface, it is chaos. The Columbia pours into the sea with the force of a liquid hurricane, pushing out at 4 to 7 knots against incoming swells that can rise 30 feet or more. When those waves hit the outgoing current, they break from below, towers of green water exploding upward. A calm surface can become a killing field in a matter of minutes. Mariners had another name for it, the graveyard of the Pacific. Since the early days of exploration, the entrance had claimed thousands of ships. Schooners, steamers, fishing boats, even Navy vessels docked the same power that carved the inland waterways of the Pacific Northwest also erased the lives that tried to cross it. Yet, people kept coming. By the mid-19th century, Oregon and Washington were growing fast. Portland, a new city far upriver, depended on Columbia as its lifeline, its gateway to the world. To reach it, ships had to cross this deadly bar, threading a narrow channel through fog, wind, and shifting sands. Finding that channel was almost impossible. Captains would creep along the coast, eyes straining through the mist, searching for the faintest sign of the river's mouth. Sometimes they would wait offshore for days, even weeks, until the weather turned. Native pilots in long cedar canoes often paddled out to meet them, offering to guide their ships through the surf. For a price paid in cargo or coin, the government tried to help. In 1865, the first light was built on the north side of the river at a cliff called Cape Disappointment, a name as old as its reputation. 10 years later, another lighthouse rose on the opposite side at Point Adams in Oregon. Now, both edges of enough to keep frost from forming indoors. Because the system consumed vast amounts of water, a rainwater collection system was designed. Gutters on the roof channeling rainfall into a brick cistern on the northern side of the rock. There was nothing ornate about the design. Gillespie's priorities were survival and efficiency. The single touch of comfort was a cast iron coal stove in the kitchen, the one place where the keepers could gather, eat, and thaw themselves after long shifts in the cold. There was no central heating, and the damp Pacific air often soaked the walls and floors. Still, the men would have to endure. The lighthouse's most valuable feature was its first-order Fresnel lens, the largest type ever installed by the Lighthouse Board. Ordered through a San Francisco supplier in April of 1880, the lens and its cast metal frame cost about $8,200, nearly a tenth of the project's total budget. By September, every component, brass gears, clockwork, steel cage, and hundreds of precision glass prisms had been delivered to the site. But when the crates were opened, one crucial element was missing: the lamp wicks and reflector assemblies for the central burner. They had been misplaced during transit. Without them, the tower's light could not be ignited. The missing pieces would take months to replace, a delay that would soon prove fatal. By the end of that year, the Tillamook Rock lighthouse stood nearly complete. The masonry gleamed under the brief winter sun. Inside, the lens had been assembled, the boilers installed, and the interior furnished. All that remained was to finish the lamp mechanism and test the rotation. The final steps before the keepers arrived. Then came January, the storm that struck on New Year's Day. 1881 was among the worst the Oregon coast had seen in decades. For 3 nights, the Pacific roared across the rock. Wind gusts reached hurricane force, and rain hammered the unfinished tower like iron shot. Inside, Superintendent H.S. Wheeler and his small crew gathered in the base of the structure, eating a sparse meal by lamplight while the building shook around them. Somewhere in the storm, a sound rose, faint, human, desperate. Wheeler froze. It was shouting, carried through the wind. Some men claimed they even heard a dog howling. Others thought it was just a gale. Wheeler stepped outside, gripping the doorframe as waves exploded below. Out in the blackness through fog and sleet, a ship was in distress. The workers raced to the lantern room. They placed an ordinary lantern inside the massive Fresnel assembly and lit every source of flame they had. Outside, they built signal fires on the wet rock, anything that could serve as a warning to the doomed vessel. For a brief moment, the faint running lights of a ship flickered through the fog, then vanished. The cries faded into the roar of the storm. When dawn came, the sea lay strangely still. Around the rock floated wreckage, barrels, timbers, and canvas. The ship was the British bark Lupasha, a 1,300-ton two-masted vessel inbound from Japan to Portland. Her original master, Captain Irvin Raven, had died on a previous voyage, and command had passed to his brother, B.H. Raven. As the Lupasha approached the Columbia River, dense fog and a hard southwest wind pushed her dangerously close to shore. Some believed her compass had failed. Whatever the cause, the captain had unknowingly steered straight toward the Tillamook cliffs. None of the 16 men aboard survived. 12 bodies washed ashore. 4 were never found. Yet, one small miracle endured. A half-drowned Australian shepherd pup pulled alive from the surf. The dog had somehow swam more than a mile through freezing water to reach land. For the men on the rock, the sight of wreckage was devastating. The light they had built, still unfinished, still dark, had come too late. But it also confirmed the very reason they were there. Tillamook Rock needed its light. Construction resumed as soon as the weather cleared. On January 21, 1881, less than 3 weeks later, 5 oil wicks were ignited within the Fresnel lens. The beam of white light pierced the darkness, visible more than 22 miles out to sea. The Tillamook Rock Lighthouse had finally come to life. It had taken $575 days from the first blast of dynamite to the first flash of light, at a total cost of $123,493, more than twice its original estimate. In less than 2 years, men had managed what most had called impossible. They had built one of the boldest, most isolated lighthouses in the history of the United States. A fortress carved into living stone, defying the Pacific itself. The first headkeeper, Albert Roeder, arrived with 3 assistants. Shipwrecks along the stretch of Oregon's coast fell sharply. Mariners who once called the region the graveyard of the Pacific began to trust its waters again. But the light came at a price few could endure. Keepers lived by a rotation, 42 days on the rock, 21 days on shore. There was no steady contact with land. No telegraph, no radio, no rescue boat. Supply ships came only when the weather allowed. Sometimes after days, sometimes after weeks. Everything from coal to canned food had to be winched up through waves by rope and pulley. Roeder lasted 4 months. Most didn't make it much longer. The constant roar, the damp, the monotony. They broke men down faster than the sea ever could. Still, a few endured. William Dahlgren stayed from 1901 to 1919. Robert Jariff remained from 1903 to 1928. George Wheeler served from 1929 to 1952. And Oswald Alec, who arrived in 1937 as 4th assistant, would become the station's final headkeeper 15 years later. In the early decades, Tillamook Rock was as isolated as a ship adrift. The nearest harbor lay 30 meters away. On clear days, the Oregon coastline was a pale line on the horizon. On most, it vanished completely. When storms closed in, the men had only flares for emergencies, rarely used because launching one meant admitting panic. There was no lifeboat, no escape. The sea surrounded them like a wall. As years passed, a few improvements reached them. On November 4, 1895, a telegraph line was laid from Fort Stevens to the mainland, the first tenuous connection between the rock and civilization. 2 years later, in 1897, an experimental telephone line was added. It lasted only months before a storm ripped it down. In 1898, the station roof was raised and reinforced. Inside, life was brutally simple. When the station first opened, the keeper quarters had tall rectangular windows with safety glass panes. They offered light until they didn't. In 192, a violent storm shattered nearly all of them. The replacements were 3-in-thick circular portholes sealed with cement. The living space dimmed into a perpetual twilight, damp, echoing, and claustrophobic. By the 1920s, technology crept forward. In 1924, the old oil vapor lamps were replaced with a 300W electric bulb. For the first time, the keepers could operate the light without trimming wicks or refilling oil. But the station wasn't fully electrified until 1932, when a new wiring system and steam-powered heating were installed, a luxury they had dreamed of for decades. Even so, nothing softened the storms. January 1883, a gale tore the iron roof from the fog signal house. December 1886, another storm ripped half a ton of concrete from the foundation and hurled it into the main building. December 1887, a single rogue wave engulfed the entire lighthouse, shattering glass in the lantern room and flooding the tower. December 1894, 13 more lantern panes were smashed in one night. 1913, the same white hurricane that ravaged the Great Lakes pounded Tillamook Rock for 15 hours straight. Inside, the keepers prayed the entire structure wouldn't be torn from its basalt roots and carried out to sea. Yet, the rock held. It always did. But in October of 1934, the ocean unleashed its worst. On October 21, 1934, the worst storm in the station's history struck. The barometer plunged. Winds hit 109 miles per hour, roughly 175 kilometers per hour. The keepers described it as if the Pacific had come alive. The sea rose in walls, smashing against the rock with the power of artillery. That night, waves hurled boulders of basalt the size of furniture across the deck. One broke through the lantern room, sending theater and glass cascading down the spiral stairs. Inside, men clung to railings as the entire tower shook under their feet. When daylight returned, the damage was staggering. The building was flooded, more than 4 feet deep. And the original first-order Fresnel lens, the most expensive part of the lighthouse, was completely destroyed. It took 4 months and $12,000 to repair the damage. By February 1935, a new arrow beacon replaced the shattered lens. The lantern room windows were reinforced with steel mesh like the bars of a cage. Tillamook Rock had become less of a lighthouse and more of a fortress. Even so, life went on. The station's record of safety was impressive given its conditions, but not flawless. In 1911, years before the big storm, Second Assistant Thomas Jones had fallen 25 feet from the hoisting rig. He was evacuated to Bay City Hospital, but never woke again. His name was later inscribed in the Coast Guard's Book of Honor. By the late 1930s, the crew had settled into a rhythm that was part discipline, part endurance. The same sound marked every night. The rhythmic groan of the foghorn, the wind rattling steel shutters, and the endless pulse of the sea. They had learned to live with the storms, to time their meals around them, to measure silence not in minutes, but in the number of rotations the light made. Some keepers hated the rock, others found, strangely, a kind of peace there. The solitude stripped life down to its simplest form. Keep the light burning, no matter what. George Wheeler, who arrived in 1929, served 23 years, longer than anyone before him. He once wrote that on calm nights, the beam seemed to sweep through eternity itself. When he retired in 1952, his former assistant, Oswald Alec, took command, the last man to hold the post. By then, the outside world was changing. Automation had begun. Airplanes used radio beacons and mariners relied more on radar. The age of manual lighthouses was ending. On September 1st, 1957, after 77 years of service, the light at Tillamook Rock was officially extinguished. The beam that had guided sailors for generations blinked out for the last time. The men secured the doors, packed their belongings, and stood for one final look at the sea, the same view hundreds had endured before them. Then they boarded the supply boat and left terrible Tilly behind. For the first time since 1881, the rock was silent. In the decades that followed, storms continued to pound it. The walls cracked, the windows corroded with salt, seabirds nested in the lantern tower, and sea lions hauled themselves onto the old crane platform. The Pacific was reclaiming what had always been its own. By the 1970s, Tillamook Rock passed through the hands of several private owners, each dreaming of restoring it, each defeated by cost and logistics. Helicopters were the only safe way to land. Maintenance alone was a small fortune. Then in 1980, a group of investors bought the property with a strange idea to turn the abandoned lighthouse into a columbarium, a cemetery at sea. They called it Eternity at Sea, for prices between $1,000 and $5,000. Families could send the ashes of loved ones to rest within the stone walls of terrible Tilly. Only about 30 people ever did. The permits lapsed in 1999, and the state refused to renew them. Today, Tillamook Rock is part of the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge, home to thousands of sea lions, seals, and seabirds. The structure still stands. Battered and dark, its windows sealed, its light long gone. But its presence, that lonely silhouette rising from the gray, still commands awe. And before the keepers left in 1957, Oswald Alec, the final head keeper, opened the logbook and wrote one last entry. Farewell, Tillamook Rock Light Station. An era has ended. With this final entry, and not without sentiment, I return thee to the elements. You one of the most notorious and yet fascinating of the sea-swept sentinels in the world. Long the friend of the tempest-tossed mariner. Through howling gale, thick fog, and driving rain, your beacon has been a star of hope, and your foghorn a voice of encouragement. May the elements of nature be kind to you. For 77 years, you have beamed your light across desolate acres of ocean. Keepers have come and gone. Men lived and died. But you were faithful to the end. May your sunset years be good years. Your purpose is now only a symbol, but the lives you have saved and the service you have rendered are worthy of the highest respect. A protector of life and property to all. May old-timers, newcomers, and travelers along the way pause from the shore in memory of your humanitarian role. Tillamook was a battle between man and nature, but at Smalls, there was no battle left to fight. Only two men, a corpse, and a hand that wouldn't stop waving long after the storm was gone. The Smalls lighthouse died in the final days of 1773. The Irish Sea turned black. A 1,000-ton clipper named Pennsylvania fought through a night of roaring wind and steel gray water. She had almost reached her destination, Bristol, England, when the gale shifted without warning. The storm was no longer a storm. It was chaos itself. Rain hammered her deck like shot from a musket. The captain, blinded by spray, could barely hear his own orders. Hours passed, the wind screamed, and every wave struck like a hammer against the hull. Then, just before dawn, the lookout saw it. A jagged outline of black rock rising out of the white surge. There was no time to turn. The ship slammed broadside into the Smalls rocks, a cluster of reefs 20 miles off the coast of Wales. Her timbers split open like ribs under pressure. In minutes, the Pennsylvania broke apart. 75 people were lost. For weeks afterward, the wreckage washed ashore along the Pembrokeshire coast. Barrels, planks, splintered hull pieces, and the occasional body. Each tide delivered another reminder. The Smalls were a death trap. Mariners knew those rocks well. They sat low in the water, invisible under high tide and barely breaking the surface even at noon. The highest point of the reef rose only 3.5 meters above the sea. Yet it lay directly in the path of the shipping lanes between Ireland and Liverpool. It had been destroying ships for generations. But this time, the tragedy struck too close to commerce to ignore. Among the men who heard of the Pennsylvania's fate was John Phillips, a Liverpool dockmaster and merchant with a reputation for impossible ideas. He had long dreamed of building a lighthouse on those rocks, a light that would be known from all others in the world the moment it was seen by night or by day. People laughed. The Smalls were 20 meters offshore, surrounded by furious tides with no natural shelter. No one in Britain, not even Trinity House, the official authority for navigation, believed a permanent structure could stand there. But Phillips was stubborn. He'd already petitioned for permission as early as 1765, only to be denied. Now, with the loss of the Pennsylvania, his proposal suddenly seemed urgent. The merchants of Liverpool and Bristol began to listen. He offered a daring financial plan. He would fund construction himself using part of the Milford light dues, fees collected from ships entering nearby Milford Haven, and in return, he would maintain the light privately without burdening trade or taxpayers. It was a remarkable offer, but it took disaster to make it real. On August 4, 1774, the Crown granted John Phillips a 99-year lease for the Smalls Rocks. He would have his chance to build what no one else dared attempt, a lighthouse in the middle of the Irish Sea. Phillips began advertising for designs that same year. From Liverpool came a surprising candidate, Henry Whiteside, a musical instrument maker. He had never built a lighthouse, never worked in heavy construction, and had no formal training in engineering. But his proposal caught Phillips's eye for one reason. It was different. Whiteside envisioned a structure that wouldn't fight the sea, but let it pass through. An octagonal wooden house only 4.5 meters across, perched on 9 slender legs, 5 made of oak, 3 of cast iron, arranged in a circle around a central timber post. The living quarters and lantern would rest high above the waves, allowing storms to rage harmlessly below. It was, as one observer later called it, a hut on stilts in the middle of eternity. Still, Phillips believed Dot, and so in 1775 he assembled a small crew and set sail from Liverpool toward the most treacherous pile of rocks in Wales, determined to build a light that could defy the sea. By the summer of 1775, the impossible was underway. The ship Unity left Liverpool under gray skies, carrying an unlikely crew. Henry Whiteside, the musical instrument maker turned engineer. James Summers, his foreman, 8 miners, a blacksmith, and 2 laborers. Their destination, a handful of reefs 20 miles out, where no man could safely stand for more than an hour before the tide reclaimed the stone beneath him. Before venturing to sea, Whiteside had assembled a full-scale prototype of the lighthouse on land in the sheltered cove of Sulva, a small Welsh harbor 25 miles from the Smalls. Every beam, every bolt, every panel of the octagonal hut was measured and fitted like an instrument. The product of a mind that thought in harmonies, not blueprints. When spring came, they dismantled the structure, loaded the parts onto the Unity, and sailed toward the open Irish Sea. The Smalls greeted them with the sound of thunder. The reef barely broke the surface, jagged and wet, with gulls shrieking overhead. Whiteside's men worked when they could, but the sea allowed them only small mercies. Between June and October 1775, they managed to set foot on the rock for just 9 days in total. Every approach required precise timing. The ship would hover just long enough to drop men and tools before retreating to deeper water as the tide rose. Sometimes when weather closed in, the workers were left behind for days, camping on the bare rock with only a small hut for shelter and the roar of the sea around them. By October 5th, with winter looming, they abandoned the site, having bored a single 18-in hole into the granite for the central pillar, marked the outlines for the others, and erected a storage shed. Still, Whiteside was undeterred. He reported confidently that the rock, though hard as marble, worked extremely well, and that completion was certain if construction could resume by April 1776. That spring, he returned with renewed determination. All through the summer, they labored, bolting timber legs into sockets cut into the stone, hoisting beams by hand-cranked winches, and praying that the Atlantic would stay calm long enough to let them finish. At last, on September 1st, 1776, John Phillips proudly declared the Smalls lighthouse complete. That it was by any measure a strange sight. An octagonal wooden hut perched on 9 pillars arranged in a 30-foot circle, 8 around the edge and 1 in the center. Most were English oak, though 3 of the outer supports were cast iron cylinders, each 6 feet long and joined by flanged bolts. Later, many of the iron posts were replaced with sturdier oak beams fell from aristocratic estates across England. Some noble families reportedly mourned the loss of their finest forest kings. Massive trees hauled hundreds of miles to stand in lonely defiance above the gray sea. The living quarters contained 2 cramped rooms, a storeroom below for coal, oil and provisions, and a lantern room above. The keepers reached it by a ladder leading through a trapdoor dot inside the southern corner of the hut, held shelves of oil, spare reflectors, and food. A small crane jutted from the north side to haul up barrels from supply boats. The light itself consisted of 4 oil lamps with polished glass reflectors arranged to produce 2 distinct colors. A bright white beam could be seen up to 12 miles away in clear weather, while a faint green light visible only from certain directions marked the channel between nearby rock groups known as the Hats and the Barrels. Theoretically, a navigator who saw both beams could gauge his position between the reefs. In practice, it was suicidal to sail close enough to test the idea. Yet, to the astonishment of skeptics, the lighthouse worked. On December 9, 1776, Captain Anthony of the vessel Felix reported sighting the Smalls light at 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 leagues away, and following it safely until dawn. He described it as a great comfort to him and his crew. High praise for a light that months earlier had been dismissed as fantasy. Phillips had done it. He had built the unbuildable, a lighthouse standing alone in the Irish Sea, its thin wooden legs braced against eternity. But triumph at sea never lasts long. By December 1777, the same winter storms that had doomed the Pennsylvania returned. Waves struck the tower with such force that the entire structure swayed like a mast. The keepers inside, 2 men assigned to watch the new beacon, sent word that the building shook violently with every wave, and they feared it would collapse before spring. Whiteside himself sailed out in January 1777, accompanied by a blacksmith and 2 assistants to reinforce the tower. He added extra oak piles and diagonal braces, bolting them into the central frame. The work was slow and perilous. Each day the men fought wind and tide. Each night they prayed that the next morning would come. Then came disaster, and one of the most extraordinary rescue stories in lighthouse history. While still finishing the reinforcements, Whiteside and his small team were caught by a storm that lasted over 2 weeks. They were trapped in the tower along with the 2 resident keepers. With almost no food or water, no ship could reach them. The seas boiled around the pillars. As supplies dwindled, they realized they were on the brink of starvation. In desperation, Henry Whiteside wrote a message describing their plight, sealed it in a bottle, and fearing that a simple bottle would sink or shatter, placed it inside a small wooden crate, which he then hurled into the sea. Days later, a fisherman found the box washed ashore. Inside, the message was still legible. He carried it to local authorities, and within days, a rescue vessel was dispatched. Against all odds, it reached the Smalls. The men, weak, dehydrated, and half delirious, were brought safely to the mainland. Whiteside's invention had saved their lives once, but his patron's fortune could not save the light. John Phillips, now financially ruined by the endless cost of maintenance, could no longer fund operations. He extinguished the lamp and released the keepers. But the shipping community of Liverpool and Bristol refused to let the beacon die. The Smalls light had already proved its worth. Ships were safer, captains were grateful, and merchants saw the profit in survival. By 1778, a coalition of traders petitioned for government intervention. Trinity House, the British authority over lighthouses, stepped in, obtained a parliamentary act, and took control of the Smalls Lighthouse. They agreed to repair and maintain it, granting Phillips a symbolic lease of 99 years at £5 a year in recognition of his service. Under Trinity House, the Smalls light returned to life, but for the men who worked there, perched 72 feet above an ocean that never slept, the light would soon prove to be both salvation and torment. From the outside, the Smalls Lighthouse looked calm, a thin-legged guardian of the Irish Sea, its white beam cutting through the fog like a promise of safety. But for the men who lived inside it, that light was a curse that never slept. When Trinity House took over in 1778, they inherited both the beacon and the nightmare that came with it. They reinforced the structure, improved the lamps, and brought order to its operations. But the sea did not care about organization. To the Atlantic, the tower was still nothing more than an intruder, a fragile wooden skeleton standing in defiance of nature. From the moment the first new keepers arrived, the reports began. The tower swayed constantly. With each wave, the entire building shuddered and creaked, its 9 pillars flexing like the strings of a violin. The men described the motion as being like living inside the mast of a ship. When storm struck, and they struck often, the sound was unbearable. Waves roared straight through the open space between the stilts, slamming against the beams. The structure quivered from base to lantern. The floors trembled, the oil lamps swayed, and dishes slid off shelves. At night, when the wind rose to a scream, the keepers could feel the entire hut lean 9 and out of line before snapping back again. There were no radios, no telegraphs. The only contact with land was a supply boat that came when weather allowed. Sometimes after weeks, sometimes after months. The keepers had no schedule, no certainty of when they would see another human face. Food came in barrels. Salted meat, flour, coal, oil, and water collected from rain or carried in casks. When the sea was rough, nothing came at all. When it was calm, they hoisted supplies by a crane attached to the north pillar, hauling ropes slick with seaweed, shouting orders over the wind. In winter, storms could last for days without a break. Waves rose higher than the living quarters, slamming into the wooden walls. Inside, men slept in turns, fearing the next crash would tear the legs from under them. The lantern shook so violently that the flame often had to be relit by hand. Even on quiet days, the sea never stopped moving. The sound was constant. A low, rhythmic moan through the pillars that made the air vibrate like a giant instrument. The keepers called it the singing of the sea. It was hypnotic, sometimes soothing, sometimes maddening. Over the years, every man who worked the Smalls left changed in. Some returned quiet and withdrawn, unable to sleep without the sound of wind and water. Others turned bitter or superstitious. A few refused to go back, no matter the pay dot. By 1800. The Smalls had earned a grim reputation among sailors. It was called the Lighthouse for the damned. Yet still, men volunteered, driven by pride or need, or perhaps by the same strange pull that had drawn John Phillips there years before. The lighthouse had been standing for nearly 25 years. Its structure had survived endless punishment. Repairs were frequent: new braces, new bolts, patches to lantern glass shattered by salt and wind. The light itself never failed for long, but the price was high. In February 1790, a gale tore through the tower, ripping away part of the lantern roof. The keeper survived, but one was later found half deaf from the pressure of the wind dot in 1797. Another storm flooded the cellar through its watertight hatch, proving nothing was ever truly sealed against the sea. By now, those who manned the Smalls were working in a structure that had been described by the engineer, Robert Stevenson, as nothing more than a raft of timber, rudely put together. He wasn't wrong. Even Trinity House admitted that the building's days were numbered, but replacing it was expensive, and the light dues collected from passing ships brought in a steady income. So, the wooden-legged tower remained. The winter of 1801 was brutal, even by Welsh standards. Storms rolled endlessly across the Irish Sea, one after another, without pause. The air itself seemed made of salt and fury. On those black horizons, where the ocean met the sky, stood the Smalls Lighthouse, a thin, trembling shape perched on 9 wooden legs. Inside it, 2 men worked by the light of 4 oil lamps: Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffiths. Both were Welshmen, both seasoned keepers, and both known ashore for their constant bickering. They argued about everything from how to polish the brass fittings to whose turn it was to cook. Yet for all their friction, they shared a duty that demanded absolute cooperation: to keep the light burning no matter what. In those days, there were no radios, no telegraphs, not even a standardized signal code for passing ships. Once the supply boat left, the men were cut off from the world. Relief would come only when the weather allowed, sometimes after weeks or months. That winter, no relief came. Gales roared across the Irish Sea for nearly 4 months, trapping the 2 men in the wooden tower. Day after day, waves pounded the stilts until the entire structure groaned like a living thing. The noise was constant, a mix of wind, wood, and water that made conversation almost impossible. Then one night, tragedy struck. Thomas Griffiths was climbing to the lantern room when he slipped on the narrow stair and struck his head on an iron stanchion. The sound echoed through the small chamber, a sharp metallic crack followed by silence. Howell rushed up and found his partner sprawled on the floor, lifeless. There was no help to call, no signal to send. Howell was alone, trapped in a tower 72 feet above the sea with a dead man and weeks of storms ahead. He knew what people thought of them back on shore, that they argued constantly, that tempers flared. If a rescue boat arrived and only one man was found alive, what story would they tell? That one Thomas had killed the other in anger? That the sea had driven them mad? A burial at sea would look like murder. So Howell made a terrible choice. He built a coffin. He had once been a joiner, a woodworker, and with that old skill, he tore apart part of the interior walls of the living quarters and began constructing a makeshift box dot. It took him days working alone while the wind screamed through the cracks in the walls. When it was done, he placed Griffith's body inside, recorded the death in the logbook, and raised the distress flag, hoping a passing ship might notice. No one came. The smell grew unbearable. The air turned foul, thick with rot. Howell could no longer eat, barely slept. Desperate, he dragged the coffin through the narrow trap door and out to the outer gallery, the small wooden platform that circled the lantern. He lashed the coffin to the railings so it wouldn't be swept away. then retreated inside to wait for rescue. The days blurred, the storms raged on. And then one night, the wind rose to a shriek, strong enough to tear the coffin apart. When morning came, Howell looked through the small round window and froze. The coffin was gone, but the body remained, tangled in ropes, one arm stretched upward, caught by the wind. Every gust made it move as if waving. For weeks, the body stayed there, swaying with every gust. A pale silhouette in the lightning. Ships that passed in the distance saw the lights still burning and a figure on the gallery waving. They assumed all was well. Inside Bowsam and Howell's mind began to fray. He continued to tend the lamp, trimming the wick, refilling the oil because the duty was all he had left to cling to. He wrote in the log, though the words grew shorter, less coherent. He barely ate. The sound of the sea filled every waking moment, and that arm, always in the corner of his eye, seemed to move, even when the wind stopped. By the time the weather cleared enough for a boat to reach the Smalls, weeks had passed. When the rescue crew climbed the rope ladder and entered the living quarters, they were met with a stench so strong that men gagged. The furniture was broken, the walls stained with smoke, and the air heavy with decay. Howell sat silently in the corner, his face gaunt and gray, eyes hollow. He didn't speak when they asked what had happened. Then they climbed to the gallery. There, lashed to the railing, Thomas Griffiths' body still hung, its arms stiff and wind-burned, the skin blackened by salt and cold. The men stared in horror. Only then did they understand the nightmare Howell had lived through. He was brought back to Pembrokeshire, physically alive, but changed beyond recognition. Friends who met him said they could barely recognize the man who had left only a few months earlier. His hair had turned white. He rarely spoke. He never returned to sea again. For the rest of his life, Howell was haunted by that winter. What he endured, the silence, the storms, the dead companion waving endlessly outside his window, became legend. The tale spread through every port in Britain. A story whispered among lighthouse keepers as a warning of what isolation could do to the human mind. It also changed history. When Trinity House investigated the incident, they concluded that two men were not enough for such remote stations. From that year forward, no offshore lighthouse would ever again be manned by fewer than 3 keepers. The Smalls tragedy had rewritten the rules of lighthouse keeping and left behind one of the most haunting images in Maritime. History a dead man waving from the storm, and another slowly losing his sanity beneath the light that would not go out. By the early 19th century, the Smalls Lighthouse had already survived what most would have called impossible. It had stood through gales that ripped ships apart through the long winter of 1801 that had driven one man to the edge of madness. But it could not stand forever. The structure, now nearly 60 years old, creaked and swayed with each storm. Its 9 oak legs, once strong and golden, had been replaced and rebolted so many times that no one could tell which timbers were original. The lantern had been rebuilt after hurricanes, its braces replaced after lightning strikes, and its joints filled with pitch and prayer. Engineers who inspected it called it a raft of timber rudely put together. Even the men who worked inside it said it leaned several inches out of line whenever a wave struck. And yet the Smalls kept shining. Through the early 1800s, Trinity House continued to maintain the wooden tower, renewing the beams, patching the lantern, and reinforcing its base with new braces and stays. But every repair caused money and danger. In 1811, a hurricane tore the lantern off completely. In 1833, another storm smashed the keeper's quarters, ripped away 4 of the supporting stays, and killed one of the men inside. The survivors waited 8 days before rescue boats could reach them. When help finally came, the lighthouse was barely standing. It had become obvious that the Smalls could not be repaired indefinitely. A new design, stronger, taller, built to withstand centuries, was needed. By 1849, Trinity House officially approved plans to replace the old wooden tower. They turned to the same generation of engineers who had reshaped British lighthouse design after the success of Smith's Eddy Tower. James Walker, Fellow of the Royal Society, and James Nicholas Douglas, his young resident engineer. Their task was monumental. The Smalls was among the most remote lighthouse sites in the British Isles, 20 miles offshore, accessible only in calm weather, surrounded by some of the roughest waters of the Irish Sea. In 1856, the Board of Trade finally sanctioned the project. Douglas landed with a small crew on September 2, 1856, to begin surveying the rock. Even landing there was a battle. The sea clawed at the boats, and the men had to time their jumps to the rise and fall of the swell. The foundations took months of cutting and blasting. The men drilled into the ancient granite with hand tools, clinging to the wet stone while waves crashed over them. An iron bar 2 in thick and 3 feet long was hammered into the rock as a test anchor. The next day, the sea had bent it like wire. That was the power they were building against. On June 26, 1857, they laid the first stone of the new Smalls Lighthouse. Every block of granite was carved and fitted on shore in Pembrokeshire before being shipped to the site. Each piece was numbered and grooved like a puzzle. The stones were joined with an ingenious interlocking system. Square holes and slate wedges called joggles that bound every 3 layers together like a single mass dot. It was a technique perfected at Eddystone, now refined to withstand even greater fury. The lower 45 feet of the tower were built solid with no internal chambers, just sheer weight and stone. Above that rose the living quarters, workshop, and lantern room, all encased in walls 5 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 feet near the top. From base to gallery, the new Smalls Tower stood 114 feet tall, nearly twice the height of its wooden predecessor. For 5 years, the work continued, dictated by weather and tide. Crews lived on supply ships, waiting for calm seas to carry them onto the rock. Progress was slow but relentless. And then on August 7, 1861, the new light was lit for the first time. The difference was staggering. The old structure, the so-called Philippine hut, had been a fragile spider of wood, trembling, soaked, always at the edge of collapse. The new tower was a granite monolith, red and white horizontal bands shining like a monument to human stubbornness. Its main light, placed 126 feet above high water mark, could be seen 17 miles away. A secondary red sector light at 107 feet warned ships of the dangerous Hats and Barrels rocks to the east. For the first time in a century, the keepers of the Smalls could stand on solid ground. The tower no longer swayed. The sound of the sea was still deafening, but now it echoed through stone instead of timber. It had taken 50,125 pounds, 5 years, and the deaths of countless ships to get here. But at last the Smalls had been reborn, not as a desperate experiment, but as a triumph of engineering. When the new granite lighthouse was finished, the old wooden structure still stood beside it, a frail skeleton beside a giant. It had served for 85 years. Through every storm, the Irish Sea could deliver. The keepers who once feared its collapse now looked at it almost with pity. Soon after the new light was operational, the wooden tower was dismantled. Its timbers weather-bleached and splintered. No piece of it was preserved. The sea that had tried for decades to destroy it finally took back what was hers. Yet its legacy lived on. Whiteside's unorthodox idea, a lighthouse raised on stilts so that the waves could pass through it, had inspired generations of sea engineers. Hundreds of offshore platforms from beacons to oil rigs would use the same principle in centuries to come. And the story of the men who lived and died inside, it would become legend. The new tower also faced its own battles. Waves that once shattered the wooden stilts now slammed into the granite base with the same relentless rhythm. The Atlantic hurled itself against the walls, rising in sheets of white spray that drenched the windows 200 feet above the surface. Inside, the life of a keeper remained one of isolation. Though safer, the Smalls was still the most remote lighthouse in Wales, nearly 21 miles offshore. Cut off for weeks at a time, the stone tower might not have swayed, but the men inside still felt the weight of the sea pressing against their minds. Their only contact with land came through the supply ships from St. David's or Milford Haven, bringing food, oil, and news from the world. Messages were sent by semaphore flags or by letters tossed into supply boxes. When the weather turned bad, they were again alone. By the early 20th century, the lighthouse had witnessed nearly every change in maritime history. Steamships replaced sails. Then came the era of radio, radar, and steel. But in that small circle of rock, the rhythm never changed. Wind, waves, light, and waiting. In 1878, the tower was already showing its resilience. When other lights on the coast were damaged by storms, the Smalls stood untouched. The design of James Douglas, interlocked. Granite blocks sealed with joggles had proven almost invincible. Still, nothing lasts forever. The same salt air that had devoured the wooden tower began to eat at the iron railings and the lantern fittings. In 1978, engineers installed a hull above the lantern to allow helicopters to land directly. A quiet revolution that changed the way keepers came and went. It was a strange sight. The old red and white tower topped with a modern steel platform bridging 2 centuries of engineering. 9 years later, in 1987, the Smalls Lighthouse was automated. The final keepers packed their belongings, sealed the logbook, and boarded the helicopter that would take them away. For the first time since 1776, no human hand would tend its flame. The light itself, now electric, continued to flash. Bright white beams visible 17 meters across the Irish Sea. But there were no footsteps on the stairs, no ticking of clockwork, no voices in the kitchen below. In the years that followed, the red and white stripes that had long marked its walls were removed. The tower was grit blasted back to bare granite. A return to its natural color, the same gray stone that had first been quarried from the Welsh coast over a century before. Today, the Smalls Lighthouse is still there, a lonely sentinel in the Irish Sea. It no longer needs keepers. It no longer needs rest. Controlled remotely from Trinity House's center in Harwich, it stands as a monument to every man who once risked his sanity to keep the light alive. More than 200 years have passed since Thomas Howell stared through a rain-streaked window and saw a dead man's arm waving in the storm. More than a century since the granite tower replaced the trembling wooden stilts. But if you sail out past the Marloes Peninsula on a calm night when the sea is flat and the stars are sharp, you can still see it. A single flash of light, steady and cold, cutting across the dark horizon. That light is burned through war, madness, and time itself. It was built by dreamers, tested by storms, and kept alive by men who learned that solitude can be as dangerous as the sea. It's said that when the wind hits the gallery railings just right, it still makes a sound, a low rhythmic whistle like a long, slow wave goodbye. And somewhere in that sound, if you listen closely enough, you might still hear the ghost of Thomas Howell's final promise. As long as I breathe, the light will not go out. If the Smalls Lighthouse revealed what isolation can do to the living across the Atlantic, on the far edge of Florida's coast stands a tower older than the nation itself. Its light born from empire, rebuilt through tragedy, and haunted by those who refuse to leave their post. Here, every flicker carries a memory, and every shadow has a name. The haunted shadows of the St. Augustine Lighthouse. Every coastline begins with a story, and this one begins with a flame. Long before the United States had a flag or a name, a Spanish soldier stood on this same stretch of Atlantic shore, striking flint above a pitch-soaked torch. The year was 1565, and Pedro Mendez de Avalos had just founded St. Augustine, the first enduring European settlement in what would become America. He called it San Augustine, and it was meant to be eternal. For more than 4 centuries, this narrow peninsula, cut by inlets ringed by dunes, would trade hands, burn, rebuild, and burn again. The Spanish raised their mission walls. The French privateers and British raiders came to tear them down. In 1586, Sir Francis Drake's ships appeared on the horizon, their sails black with smoke from the towns he'd already plundered. The city was sacked and set ablaze. Yet even then, St. Augustine refused to vanish when the fires cooled. The Spaniards built a watchtower of Coin stone on the north end of Anastasia Island. It was meant to guard the mouth of Matanzas Bay, a narrow channel whose shores could shred a hull in minutes. That tower, simple, unpainted, its beacon, a cage of burning wood, would become the ancestor of every lighthouse ever raised on the American coastline. It stood through centuries of siege, the 1702 assault of Queen Anne's War, the 1740 British siege under Governor Oglethorpe, and the uneasy peace that followed. In 1763, the battered settlement was traded to Britain like a pawn in an empire's game. British engineers strengthened the tower, setting a true lantern on its crown. Sailors began calling it the St. Augustine Light. In the summer of 1763, one of the first British vessels to arrive, HMS Industry, never made port. She struck the shoals directly beneath the tower and went down within sight of its flame. The story spread quickly among dock workers. The new masters had inherited a cursed coast. When Spain reclaimed Florida 2 decades later, the old light remained. It changed hands again in 1821 when the United States took possession of the territory, and the U.S. Coastal Survey listed it as the earliest permanent aid to navigation on the continental United States. For nearly 300 years, that beacon rebuilt, relit, renamed, guided ships through war and storm. But the sea here is patient, It does not forget what belongs to it. By the mid-1800s, erosion had begun eating away the base of the ancient tower. Each year, the tide crept closer. Keepers logged cracks in the foundation, stones falling like teeth into the surf. In the summer of 1859, tragedy struck. Joseph Andro, the lighthouse keeper, fell from his scaffolding while whitewashing the tower. His body struck the oil room roof, then the wall below before hitting the courtyard stones. The obituary spared no detail. 19th century journalism rarely did. Locals whispered that his ghost climbed the stairs at night, still tending to the flame. His widow, Maria Mester de Dolores Andrew, took his place. A rare woman in such a post, and became the first female lighthouse keeper in Florida. The first Hispanic American to oversee a federal shore installation. She kept the light burning for years while the sea gnawed at the cliff beneath her feet. By the 1870s, the Atlantic had claimed too much ground. The tower leaned and waves broke against its door. The government decided to build a new lighthouse 500 yards inland. Higher, safer, modern. Brick by brick, it rose from the dunes. Its black and white spiral marking the dawn of a new era. The original tower fought to the last. On a calm morning in 1880, after a night of high tide, it simply slipped into the ocean and was gone. The new light, completed on October 15th, 1874, was everything its predecessor could not be. 165 feet tall, armed with a first-order Fresnel lens whose yellow beam reached 24 nautical miles. At night, Its rhythm of light and darkness pulsed the sea like a heartbeat. Ships passing offshore reported seeing it long before they sighted land. Mariners toasted it as the pride of the Atlantic coast. The town below began to prosper again, its docks busy with fishing boats and schooners bound for Savannah or Charleston. But the new tower had inherited more than just a legacy of navigation. It had inherited the weight of everything that had come before. The wrecks, the storms, the deaths, the whispered belief that St. Augustine's light, no matter where it stood, demanded a toll. It would soon be paid. When the keepers moved into their newly built brick residence beside the tower, they thought they were leaving behind centuries of hardship and superstition. In truth, they were only stepping into another chapter of it. The house waited at the edge of the pines, red-roofed and quiet, with its spiral stair linking to the great tower. From its parlor windows, the ocean gleamed like glass. But to those who would live inside, peace would prove an illusion. Because here, where duty ended, something else began. When the new Estine Lighthouse was completed in the autumn of 1874, it was celebrated as a triumph of engineering. Its beam reached 24 nautical miles. Bright, rhythmic, reliable, a golden heartbeat pulsing across the black Atlantic. But the real heartbeat of the station came from the small brick house beside it. Built at the same time as the tower, the keeper's house looked peaceful from the outside. 2 stories, wide verandas, and tall windows facing the sea. Yet within those walls, the life of a keeper was a test of endurance. Each night began the same. The keeper would climb the 219 steps to the lantern room, polish the brass fittings, trim the lamp's wick, wind the clockwork, and check the weather. Every 30 seconds, the great frontal lens revolved, precision as ritual. He would watch the horizon until dawn, recording in the logbook the temperature, wind, and any passing ship. Then he'd descend again, exhausted into silence. The first man to keep the new light was William Horn, a former Union officer who had survived the Civil War but not its fevers. He arrived with his wife and 3 daughters, proud to command what he called the most beautiful light in the Republic. Within months, the Florida humidity began to break him down. The malaria he had carried from the southern battlefields returned, and with it came tuberculosis, a death sentence in the 19th century. In the parlor of that house, surrounded by the laughter of his children and the ticking of the brass clock he'd once wound by habit, H's breath grew shallow. He died there, his lungs filling with blood, his eyes fixed on the tower through the window. Today, staff at the Lighthouse Museum still speak of him in present tense. They say the parlor is never truly silent. Visitors have heard a dry, hollow cough echo through the room when no one is inside. Some claim to feel the air thicken, as if someone unseen were still standing by the window keeping watch. They call him the man who still keeps watch. After Horn's death, the keeper's house hosted a long line of successors, each serving the same mechanical routine, each vanishing into history. Hurricanes came and passed. The light never failed, but the house itself seemed to absorb the rhythm of those years. The footsteps, the isolation, the fatigue. Even after modern restoration, its brick walls still breathe salt and sorrow. Then came Peter Rasmussen, appointed in 1901. Tall, austere, Danish. By descent, he served for 23 years, the longest tenure in the station's history. Locals remembered him as disciplined to the point of cruelty. He hated tourists. He hated questions. He smoked constantly, pipe smoke curling from the porch as if marking his territory. Rasmussen died in 1924, but his habits stayed behind. Museum. Volunteers working in the basement, the same cellar he once used for fuel storage, have reported a faint smell of tobacco drifting through the damp air. One evening, a janitor glimpsed a tall man in a blue suit stepping through the shadows between the brick arches. When she turned the light on, the space was empty. That basement is small and low-ceiling. Its stone floor perpetually slick with moisture from the sea. Tools sometimes move from their shelves overnight. Doors that are left open are found closed in the morning. The most unnerving sign witnesses say is the whistle, a short, sharp tone that echoes down the spiral stairwell. Skeptics blame the wind, but the sound is too precise, too deliberate, and it stops the moment anyone calls out. The staff joke that Rasmussen still dislikes company, that he's guarding his solitude the way he once guarded his lamp, but no one lingers long after dark. Upstairs, the parlor remains the heart of the legend. The original clock still hangs on the wall, its pendulum swinging. During storms, the lights in that room sometimes flicker out of rhythm with the rest of the building. Some say it happens only when the wind comes from the east, the direction of the sea, as if an old habit is stirring again. The keeper coughing, rising from his chair to check the weather. Even amid the superstition, there's respect, because every spirit tied to this house once kept others alive. They were not victims of the light, but servants of it. Men who watched while others slept, who stood between sailors and the dark. And perhaps that's why the house endures the way it does. Not as a place of fear, but of devotion so deep it outlasted death. Visitors walking the halls at night sometimes feel a hand brush against their sleeve, guiding them toward the tower stairs. They say it feels protective, not threatening, as if someone were reminding them that the watch never ends. Outside, beyond the verandas, the beam still turns, 30 seconds per rotation, just as it did in 1874. Its reflection sweeps across the keeper house windows, flashing gold, then gone. Some lights never go out, even when their keepers do. But every revolution sweeps across the same stretch of sand, a quiet patch below the tower that holds an older story, long before the keepers took their post. Before the light first shone across the Atlantic, something else happened here. Not duty, not tragedy of men, but of children. Before the keepers came, before the first logbook was ever opened, there were children playing in the dust where the tower now stands. When construction began on the new St. Augustine Lighthouse in 1871, the dunes of Anastasia Island were a skeleton of scaffolding and timber. Blocks of koina and red brick lay in orderly rows, the smell of pitch and wet lime rising from the ground. Foreman Hezekiah H. Pitty oversaw the project. A man of precision brought down from the north to replace the ancient Spanish tower that the ocean was swallowing stone by stone. For the workers, the site was labor. For their families, it was home. The Pitty family lived beside the construction yard in a small wooden cottage. His daughters, Eliza and Mary, often played near the workmen, exploring the piles of lumber and coiled rope like explorers of some new kingdom. They were joined by another girl, her name lost to history, the daughter of a laborer on the crew. By the summer of 1873, the lighthouse walls were nearly finished. Rising more than 100 feet above the dunes, supplies were carried by a wooden cart that ran along a rail line from the building site to the water below. Used to haul bricks, mortar, and sand. To adults, it was a dangerous machine. To the children, it was irresistible. On the afternoon of July 10, 1873, the workers paused for lunch. The air was heavy with salt and heat, the tide low, the rails glistening in the sun. The children climbed into the cart, laughing, daring one another to take a ride. The cart began to roll. Then it gathered speed. Down the slope it went faster, clattering, the shrieks of play turning to panic until it slammed into the gate at the base of the track. The wooden frame splintered. The cart flipped, throwing the children into the surf and pinning them beneath the weight. By the time the men reached the water, it was over. Eliza, Mary, and their friend were gone. The tragedy shook the small settlement to its core. Newspapers printed a few brief lines. A terrible occurrence at the new lighthouse works. But in town, people spoke of it for years. The Pitti family soon left St. Augustine, unable to bear the sight of the tower that had cost them so much. The following year, the lighthouse was completed. On October 15, 1874, its first keeper lit the lamp, the same beam that still turns tonight. And from the very beginning, strange stories began to surface. Workers spoke of childlike laughter drifting across the dunes after dark. Footprints, small and bare, appeared in the sand near the base of the tower after storms. Tools left neatly overnight were found scattered by morning, though the gates were locked. As decades passed, the stories multiplied. Visitors reported hearing footsteps racing along the upstairs hallway of the keeper's house, followed by the sound of giggling that faded into silence. Locks on interior doors clicked open and shut on their own. Volunteers at the museum swore they saw a young girl in a red dress standing by the upstairs window, her long hair blown across her face. When they called out, she turned, smiled faintly, and vanished. In 1965, a man renting one of the rooms claimed he woke to find a child in a white lace dress standing in his doorway. Her face was pale, expressionless. He thought she was real until within seconds her image began to thin, as if erased from the air. The staff began to refer to them collectively as the Pitti Girls. Tour guides later softened the name to the Children of the Light. They were seen as benign, even playful, ghosts of innocence, not malice, those who work late in the keeper's house. Sometimes find small handprints on the glass of the lantern room, too low to belong to an adult, too perfect to be accidents. During calm nights, when the wind pauses just long enough for the ocean to hold its breath, a faint echo of laughter can be heard rising from the stairwell. Skeptics say it's just the wind moving through the vents or distant voices from the marina. But the locals, those whose grandparents still remember the Pitti name, speak differently. They say the children never left because they never had the chance to grow beyond this place. Their joy, their curiosity, their brief lives, all sealed into the mortar before the tower was finished. And maybe that's why the light itself feels strangely alive. On stormy nights, when lightning flashes across the Atlantic, the reflection of the beam sometimes catches the waves just right. For a moment, it looks like three small figures playing in the surf, bright, weightless, and free. Then the next rotation comes, and the ocean is empty again. At St. Augustine, the sea remembers everything it takes. If St. Augustine was a place where the dead refused to leave their post, then the Flannels would be the opposite. A lighthouse where the living simply vanished. No storm, no blood, no goodbye. Just three men and a light that went dark. The eerie vanishing of the Flandin Isles lighthouse keepers. It begins where the map turns white 0.200 meters off the coast of Scotland. The Atlantic breaks against a scatter of black stone known as the Flandin Isles, 7 desolate peaks rising from the sea like the backs of drowned giants. Fishermen called them the 7 Hunters. Priests called them St. Fannin Sanctuary. Sailors, more honestly, called them cursed. For centuries, no one lived there. Only the sheep did. Fied by shepherds who swore that grazing on the island made their flocks bear twins and recover from illness. They would row their animals ashore, let them feed on the wind-bent grass, and then leave before nightfall because once the sun dipped below the horizon, no one dared sleep on a lawn moor. The locals said the island was haunted by a spirit that walked the cliffs after dark, its lantern swinging like a phantom light. But superstition has never stopped the sea from swallowing ships. By the late 19th century, the western coast of Scotland had become a graveyard of wrecks. And so in 1896, the Board of Trade ordered the construction of a lighthouse on Eilean Moor, the largest of the Flandin Isles. The Northern Lighthouse Board chose the engineers, David and Charles Stevenson. descendants of the same family that built nearly every major Scottish light. They called their project the Lighthouse at the Edge of the World. There was no harbor, no flat land, no easy landing. Everything, stone, steel, cement, oil, and food had to be hauled up sheer rock faces by crane. Workmen built small huts, called bothies, near the ruins of an ancient chapel dedicated to St. Flannan, whose name the island still bore. In the biting wind, their fires burned low, and their voices were drowned by the endless crash of surf. Still, the tower rose. Its foundation was cut straight into the basalt block by block, each joint sealed by iron dowels to resist the force of the ocean. The light itself would sit 275 feet above sea level, visible for 24 nautical miles, a pulse of safety for ships. Threading the dangerous MCH channel when the final lens was installed in December 1899, the first beam swept across the Atlantic. For the mainlanders who glimpsed it from Lewis, it was like watching a new star appear above the water. The island that no man dared to inhabit had finally been claimed by human order, by glass, brass, and routine. It should have been the end of the legend. Instead, it became the beginning of one. For the next year, the light burned flawlessly. 4 keepers worked in rotation. James Duke, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur, and Joseph Moore. Their schedules were strict. 6 weeks on the island, 2 weeks off, ensuring that 3 men were always present to keep the watch. They kept daily logs, measured wind and tide, and reported every ship that passed. The isolation was harsh, but predictable. Out there, routine was survival. Trim the wick, polish the brass, record the barometer, eat, sleep, repeat. And every 30 seconds, the same rotation of light turning endlessly above the void. On the mainland, people joke that the Flannan keepers had one of the loneliest jobs in the world. Yet for men like Duke and Marshall, loneliness was a kind of faith. They trusted the clockwork, the oil, and one another. The tower never failed them, and they never failed the tower. But the sea remembers its own. By December 1900, barely a year after the first light, storms began to lash the Hees with unusual ferocity. Waves struck higher than the cliffs. Seabirds vanished. Fishermen on the island of Lewis reported flashes over Am Moor, not from the lighthouse itself, but from somewhere below it, as if the sea was shining back. Then one night the light went dark. The steamship Arkour, passing on December 15th, noted the absence in its log. No light visible from Flannan Isles. It was reported to port authorities. No one acted. The light died on the night of December 15th. For 11 days, the Atlantic kept its own counsel. On Boxing Day, the lighthouse tender Hesperus pushed through winter seas toward Am Moor. The skipper expected a routine exchange: oil, mail, and the return of a keeper for his 2 weeks ashore. Instead, as the island loomed out of the spray, the crew saw no flag on the pole, no movement at the rail, no figure on the gallery. The tender sounded her horn. Silence. A flare arced into the gray. Nothing answered. They put Joseph Moore, the 4th keeper, then off rotation, into the boat and sent him for the east landing. The iron ladder was slick with weed, but intact. The derrick stood where it had always stood. Moore climbed, crossed the shoulder of rock, and reached the path that wound up toward the tower. He found the outer gate closed, the entrance door closed, and the inner door closed. The kitchen door beyond stood open. Inside, the hearth was cold, not for hours, but days. The clocks had stopped. On the table lay a set of oilskins missing from their pegs. The beds were empty, as if abandoned after morning coffee. The logbook lay where it always lay. The lamp in the lantern was cleaned, trimmed, and prepared as if the night's watch had ended precisely and deliberately. It was the tidy absence that unsettled. A house paused mid-breath. Moore went back to the boat with the news no keeper ever wants to bring. The men were gone, and there was nothing to suggest why. The Hesperus left Moore and 3 hands on the island to relight the station in search. They worked outward from the tower, reading their way into the last days by inventory and habit. Clothing accounted for gave them silhouettes in absentia. Principal keeper James Duke, 43, veteran of 2 decades at sea. Second assistant Thomas Marshall, 28, the youngest, and Donald MacArthur, 40, an occasional keeper filling in for a man on sick leave. Of the 3, MacArthur's heavy coat, the only one he was known to wear, remained on its peg, inexplicable for a December gale. They checked the lamp room order, polish, readiness. They checked the log entries through December 13th in ink. Then, routine notes for the 14th and morning of the 15th scratched on a slate. Time of extinguishing barometer wind. Nothing about catastrophe. Nothing about fear. Only the humdrum grammar of lightkeeping. The island itself gave up more complicated answers thought at the East Landing, where Moore had come ashore. Everything was in place. At the West Landing, the sea had written in a heavier hand. A storage box for tackle was gone, its ropes strewn across the rocks. Iron railings were bent or ripped free. The derrick timbers bore scars of impact. And high above the waterline, about 110 feet above sea level, a life buoy that should have hung for emergencies was missing, its fastenings torn, not untied. The evidence suggested violence, but of a very particular kind. Not human, not careful, not clean. None of it proved when the damage had been done. Some of it, later analysis showed, had already been recorded by the keepers before they vanished. But the picture that emerged felt like a sequence. Heavy seas had struck the West Landing, with force enough to wrench iron and strip lines. While inside the lighthouse routine continued, logs filled, lamp prepared, until it didn't. On the mainland, a quieter failure had unfolded in parallel. The steamship Archer, passing the Flannins on December 15th, had noted no light visible in her records and reported it on arrival. The warning never reached the northern Lighthouse board. 18 miles away at Gallon Head, gamekeeper Roderick Mackenzie, paid to watch for signals, and the nightly flame later admitted he saw no light after December 12th and told no one until questioned. A simple chain had links. The links did not hold. Moore and the relief party kept looking. They read the weather backward from sea state and cloud, then forward from the barometer scratched on the slate. They considered the psychology of the dark months. Isolation, tedium, the arithmetic of 3 men negotiating 1 rock. They knew the lore. St. Flannan's Chapel ruins near the bodies. The shepherds who grazed sheep by day and fled before nightfall. But what confronted them was not folklore. It was the geometry of absence. In time, other fragments would be swept into the official story. There were alleged additional log entries, now widely doubted, describing storms so fierce that the men prayed MacArthur weeping, and a final line storm ended, sea calm, God is over all. Whether true or apocryphal, the line persisted because it fit the shape of the void and end stop sentence at the edge of the page. What did not rely on legend were the physics around the tower in later decades. Keepers measured seas throw more than 300 feet up the cliff face at Enmore, spray reaching the lamp house itself, and 1 man nearly washed away while trying to photograph a wave. The West Landing sat squarely in the path of that energy, iron bent there like willow. By New Year's, with no bodies on shore and no further trace, the Northern Lighthouse Board convened its inquiry. 3 men had disappeared from a locked and orderly station. No smashed lantern, no blood, no quarrel apparent, just coats on hooks, oil in the lamp, clocks run down, and a winter sea that lifted and fell as it always had. What happened on Enmore remains to this day, a tight knot of facts tied to a long rope of conjecture. Pull on the rope, and you drag up waves, wind, error, and human impulse. Pull harder, and you haul in madness, murder, or myth. Either way, the knot holds. On the evening of December 26th, Moore lit the lamp again. The beam turned indifferent and exact, sweeping the same circle it had traced before the silence. Far below, the west landing took the next swell. Up in the lantern, brass ticked, glass gleamed, and the Flannan Isles resumed their watch. The men were gone. The light, faithful to its cycle, was not. For 70 years afterward, keepers stationed on the Flannan Isles worked under that same light, each man inheriting not just a post, but a question. 3 names carved into the logbook, 3 empty beds, and no answers. When the wind howled around the lantern room, some swore they heard voices carried in it, calling to each other across the black water. Others said it was just a gale through the vents. But even the most skeptical keepers admitted on Eileen Moore, silence never sounded empty. The official investigation began in early January 1901. Inspectors from the Northern Lighthouse Board arrived on Isle and Moore. Trudging the same narrow path Moore had walked alone, they found what he had, a perfectly maintained station and no sign of life. Their final report was cautious, factual, and unsatisfying. It concluded that the men had been swept away while securing equipment during severe weather. The cause of the tragedy, they wrote, was the act of God. It was a phrase that closed files but opened wounds. On the mainland, the families of Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur buried empty coffins. Newspapers printed neat columns of speculation, rogue waves, madness, murder, divine punishment. The board preferred mathematics. They estimated that a wave of over 110 feet could have struck the landing, catching all 3 men unprepared. It was possible. It was plausible. And it was easy to believe because it explained nothing. Yet the absence had weight. When relief keepers returned to duty, they noticed things. A door left open after being locked. A chair moved between watches. Once the fog signal sounded itself in clear weather. They laughed it off. Superstition was bad for discipline. But the laughter thinned when a man working the west landing alone reported hearing 3 distinct voices behind him, calling his name in the wind. He left the island on the next rotation and never volunteered again. By 1904, the story had reached poets. Wilfred Wilson Gibson published Flannan Isle, a haunting verse imagining the discovery of an empty lighthouse. The clock stopped, the table set. It blurred fact and myth so well that readers began to mistake one for the other. In the public mind, the 3 missing keepers were no longer civil servants. They were ghosts swallowed whole by a living sea. The superstition spread faster than the truth. Visitors who came to inspect the station after automation described a pressure in the air as though the island were holding its breath. A visiting mariner swore that on a foggy morning, he saw 3 black shapes perched on the gallery, motionless against the light. When the fog cleared, they were gone, leaving only a scattering of feathers caught in the rail. By the 1950s, new equipment had been installed. One keeper tried to photograph a massive wave hitting the west cliff. The picture was never taken. The wave rose higher than expected, 300 feet by his later account, and nearly carried him off the landing. He returned to the tower pale, trembling, refusing to speak. The others understood without asking, and so the silence held. When the automation order finally came in 1971, the last human keepers left Alamore without ceremony. The engines hummed, the lights still turned, and the sea remained the same. The station was now self-sufficient, self-watching, and utterly alone. But the question persisted, echoing through every new storm and every empty hallway. What happened to the men who kept the light across the Atlantic on another shore? The question's also asked, not in the salt air of Scotland, but in the frozen heart of Lake Superior. where a single tower stood 25 miles from land, built to defy the water, the wind, and the mind itself. They called it Stannard Rock, the loneliest place on Earth. At dawn, Lake Superior doesn't move. It waits, a silver sheet of water stretched to the horizon, so calm it looks solid. But every sailor knows that calm here means danger. The Ojibwe called it Gigi-Gami, the Great Sea. They believed it breathed like a living god. French explorers centuries later renamed it Lake Superior, the upper lake, the roof of the world. And long after that, the men who worked these waters just called it Superior because it was above all beyond mercy. And the lake is vast enough to make its own weather. On still mornings, fog lies flat like silk dot. By noon, it thickens into a gray wall. By nightfall, it can rise into storms that swallow ships whole. 10% of Earth's fresh water rests here. Restless, ancient, deeper than any ocean trench of its kind. The men who sailed it used to say, "You don't cross Superior. You ask to borrow it." In 1835, Captain Charles C. Stannard was one of those men. His ship, the John Jacob Astor, was hauling cargo west toward the Kiwi Peninsula when his compass began to tremble. Then a jolt. Wood scraped against rock. Soundings dropped. Beneath his hull, just 25 miles off the peninsula, he discovered a mountain. Not of earth, but of stone, invisible beneath the gray water. It rose like a knife from the lake bed, its summit only 4 to 16 feet below the surface. Half a mile long, jagged, and utterly silent. Stannard's Rock. That's what they called it afterward. He marked the spot on his charts with a single word: danger. And for decades, captains avoided it like a ghost. They'd steer 20 meters off course if it meant not passing above that hidden ridge dot in their logbooks. They called it the reef that breathes because on still days, waves seemed to heave up from nowhere as though the rock itself were alive. But as shipping traffic grew, ore freighters, coal barges, timber schooners, so did the risk. The U.S. Lighthouse Board knew they needed a beacon, something visible, permanent, unshakable. Yet the question was not how, it was where. There was no island, no dry stone, just a submerged monster in the middle of the largest lake on Earth. In 1868, the board ordered a test. An iron column 12 feet across and 20 feet tall set on the shallowest ledge of Stannard's Rock. They left it there through an entire winter. The lake threw everything it had. Gales, ice sheets, 30-foot waves. When the thaw came, the column still stood. That spring, the engineers wrote just 3 words in their report: "It can stand." 10 years later, the Spectacle Reef Lighthouse had just been finished on Lake Huron, designed by Colonel Orlando Poe and Major Godfrey Whitell, the 2 men who'd come to define how you built on nothing. They'd spent 5 years carving a foundation on open water, inventing techniques no one had tried before: cuisines sealed with oak, concrete poured into airless space, and stones fitted with iron drift pins the size of a man's arm. It had cost more than any lighthouse in the history of the Great Lakes and survived dot. So when Congress approved $50,000 in 1877 for the Stannard Rock project, they brought in Poe's same crews. Their new base camp rose near Skaney, Michigan, a temporary outpost they called Standardsville. There were no towns nearby, no roads, just a scatter of barracks, a smithy, and a dock pointing toward the empty lake dot. From here, they would build a structure that had no right to exist. They began by lowering a massive iron casing, 62 half a foot across, onto the top of the reef. Divers working blind in the freezing dark sealed its edges with layers of canvas and oakum, stuffing every seam by hand until the water stopped leaking in. Then they pumped the interior dry, scraped the stone clean, and filled the void with concrete until it stood 35 feet above the lake. That was just the foundation. The real tower would be built from sandstone quarried on Kelly's Land, hundreds of miles away. Each block was cut and numbered like a puzzle. 12 tons, 20 tons, sometimes 30. They were test-fitted on land, then shipped by barge and reassembled on the reef, one stone at a time, through wind that could lift men off scaffolds. Every block was pinned to the one below with iron drift bolts, hammered until sparks flew in the cold air. The work was relentless. Ice tore the crib apart every winter. Waves erased months of progress overnight. Sometimes they'd lose entire barges to sudden squalls. And yet, every spring they came back. By the time the tower finally rose, 5 years had passed. It had cost over $300,000, 6 times the original budget, and consumed more than 7,000 tons of concrete, 120 tons of stone, 76 tons of brick, and 126 tons of iron. But when the men stepped back and saw it in the pale summer light of 1882, it looked like something that should never have stood at all, and yet did. 78 feet tall on a base 35 feet high, walls 7.5 a foot thick at the bottom, narrowing to less than 2 feet at the top. Inside were 7 levels: the galley, sleeping quarters, library, watchroom, and above all, the lens room, a second-order Fresnel lens with 12 bullseye prisms. On July 4th, 1882, when the keeper lit it for the first time, the light reached 25 miles across the water, a pulse of gold cutting through fog and snow, flashing in rhythm like a heartbeat. The lake had its warning now. The men had their prison. Standard Rock was more fortress than home. It stood 25 miles from the nearest land. The only way you reach it was by boat, and even that most days was impossible. The waves struck the base with the force of cannon fire. Wind screamed through the lantern gallery so violently that keepers learned to shout just to hear each other. The first keeper, John Pask, transferred from the peaceful Sturgeon Point Light on Lake Huron. No one knew why he volunteered. Maybe pride, maybe the promise that anyone who served on Standard Rock would earn the right to choose their next post anywhere they wanted. He lasted 1 year. Then he left without a word. The men who replaced him called it the loneliest place on earth. The name stuck. Most lighthouses along the Great Lakes were family stations. Wives and children tending gardens, washing lantern glass, waiting for supply boats. But not here. The U.S. Lighthouse Service declared Standard Rock a stag station. No families allowed. The danger was too great. The isolation worse. Keepers lived 4 to a crew, 1 head keeper, and 3 assistants. They rotated 3 weeks on, 1 week off. But storms often erased the schedule. Some months relief boats simply never came. When the lake froze, they were trapped. Their world reduced to 1 tower surrounded by a continent of ice. The cold was so brutal that even the iron hinges seized. In winter, the door itself could freeze shut. The men used sledgehammers and pickaxes to break their way out 1 inch at a time. In November 1913, during the White Hurricane, the tower was sealed under 12 feet of ice. For a week, the keepers were buried alive. 3 men, no contact with shore, pounding pipes with wrenches to prove they were still there. When a rescue crew finally reached them, they found the entire lighthouse encased in a crystal shell, sunlight glinting off it like glass. Inside, the men were pale, exhausted, but alive. The light had never gone out. That winter became legend, proof that even the Great Lake itself couldn't extinguish what men had built. But the question lingered, one whispered by every new crew that arrived each spring. How long can you keep the light before the lake keeps you? By the 1930s, the tower had already claimed pieces of the men who served there. Those who left rarely spoke about it. The few who did said it changed their sense of time. A day might feel like a month, a season like a lifetime. When the supply boat came, it was the only proof the outside world still existed. Then came Lewis Wills, headkeeper from 1936 to 1956. 20 years of service. The longest anyone had ever endured on the reef. A quiet man from Marquette, Michigan, he rarely wrote letters home. When asked why he stayed so long, he said simply, "Someone has to keep the light." Wills holds another record, 99 consecutive days without relief. He and his assistant, Elmer Sarin, served together through countless storms, including one in 1942 when waves shattered part of the iron walkway and flooded the lower levels. Soren would later say that the sound of the foghorn during that storm felt like God himself clearing his throat. There were no telephones then, no radio contact with shore. The only connection was the faint line of smoke from a passing freighter, proof that someone else was out there in the endless cold. Men passed the time however they could. They cooked canned meat, played solitaire until the cards went soft, argued about whose turn it was to clean the lantern glass. Some carved their initials into the iron walls, tiny proofs that they existed. Others started talking to the light itself, as if it were listening. By 1944, the world had changed. Electricity reached even here. The ancient oil lamp was replaced by a 500W bulb powered by generators and an array of batteries. A small motor turned the great Fresnel lens. For the first time, the keepers didn't have to climb up every few hours to wind the mechanism. But it didn't make them any less alone. They had a refrigerator now, a radio, sometimes even a small black and white television that picked up fuzzy signals from the mainland on clear nights. But the comforts only made the silence louder. The rotation schedule was still brutal. 3 weeks on, 1 week off, weather permitting, and weather almost never permitted. Men often stayed longer, weeks longer, until supply boats could fight their way through the surf. By the 1950s, the tower had become a relic of another era. The Coast Guard began automating lights across the Great Lakes, replacing men with machines. One by one, keepers packed up and left. But Standard Rock, farthest from shore, hardest to reach, was last. Even modern equipment couldn't tame it. The lake still threw tantrums big enough to tear metal railings apart. When storms hit, the foghorn would blast for hours, its echo rolling endlessly across the water. Sometimes between bursts, there was a silence so deep it made the men flinch as if the lake itself was holding its breath. By 1961, the tower was among the last man lights on Lake Superior. It had been standing for nearly 80 years, outlasting wars, blizzards, and the loneliness of generations. But automation was coming. That summer, the Coast Guard sent a young electrician, Oscar Daniels, just 23, to prepare the tower for its final transition. His job was simple: repair the generator, check the circuits, ready the light for a life without keepers. No one knew it would also be its last season with men. At dawn, Lake Superior looked almost merciful. The air was still, the sky clear. One of those mornings that lulls you into forgetting what this lake is capable of. For the men inside Standard Rock Lighthouse, it was the last quiet they would ever know. By then, the tower had electricity, a refrigerator, even a radio that caught music from the mainland on a good day. The old brass lamp had been replaced with a 500W bulb. The foghorn to be triggered by remote signal. On paper, it was modern, safer, easier. Inside the tower that morning were 4 men. William Maxwell, 35, the engine man in charge. Walter Scotty, 22, seaman and assistant keeper. Richard Horn, only 18, the youngest aboard. And Oscar Daniels, 23, a Coast Guard electrician sent to prepare the light for full automation the next season. The head keeper, Walter Patterson, was on leave. The lake was flat as glass when Scobby woke just after sunrise. The sound he heard next was not thunder. It was sharper, closer, like the world snapping in half. A blast tore through the tower. The force threw Scobie out of his bunk. Heat followed. A rush of air so violent it ripped the door off its hinges. Smoke filled the corridor, thick and black, curling up the spiral stairs. The sound of metal screaming against stone echoed through every floor. Scobie stumbled down 2 decks, coughing, calling out. He found Oscar Daniels on the floor, alive but broken. The blast had slammed a wooden door across his legs, crushing them. Daniels was dazed, his eyes wide and unfocused. The smell of burning insulation filled the air. The entryway was gone, replaced by a column of fire rising through the heart of the tower. They could hear something below, the muffled roar of the generator room where William Maxwell had been working, but no one could reach him. The thick storm-proof windows designed to withstand 30-foot waves had shattered in the blast, leaving jagged holes in the stone. It was their only escape. Scobie hauled Daniels toward one of the openings. Together with Richard Horn, who had just reached them from the upper level, they managed to squeeze through and slide down a steel drain pipe to the base of the tower. The metal was hot to the touch. When they looked up, Standard Rock no longer looked like a lighthouse, it looked like a chimney, vomiting smoke into a cloudless sky. Only then did Scobie realize someone was missing. "Where's Maxwell?" he shouted. Daniels, still half-conscious, muttered that Horn had gone for the boat, but the blast had hurled the small skiff clear off its davits. Its shattered remains were drifting in pieces across the water. Somewhere inside that moment of chaos, Horn, dazed, burned, desperate, had dived into the freezing lake, trying to chase the wreckage. The surface temperature was 40 F. Within minutes, his limbs began to stiffen. The boat kept drifting farther. Scobie saw him, a pale shape in the steel-cold water, arms thrashing weakly. "You'll never catch it," he screamed. Horn didn't answer. His strength was leaving fast. He began to sink. Scobie grabbed the life ring from the rail and hurled it down mist. He tried again. This time, the ring struck Horn's hand. The boy managed to grip it barely. Scobie pulled, every muscle burning until Horn reached the ladder. Together they dragged him out, shivering, coughing, alive. Now only 3 remained. Maxwell was still below, somewhere inside the inferno that had once been the generator room. The flames at the base were too fierce to approach. The men knew he was gone. They could do nothing but wait. By afternoon, the radio was dead, melted in its casing. The smoke had climbed hundreds of feet, visible for miles. But out here, miles meant nothing. The nearest land was 25 away. No ships passed that day. The men built a shelter from a tarp they found among the wreckage, fastening it to the south side of the tower where the wind was weaker. They searched for food. All they found were 2 bottles of ketchup and 1 can of beans. That first night, the wind changed. The fire had died down, but the tower still smoldered. Every gust pushed smoke through cracks in the masonry. The smell of scorched metal hung heavy. Somewhere inside, beneath layers of ash and stone, was Maxwell. At midnight, Scobie climbed the tower again. He used a flashlight to flash RS through the remains of the broken lens. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short dot again and again for hours. The beam cut through the smoke, faint and trembling across the dark face of Lake Superior. No one saw it. By morning, the men's faces were gray with soot. They rationed the beams, scraping the can clean with a screwdriver. Horn's skin blistered from the cold. Daniels drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering nonsense through the pain. The second night was worse. The fog rolled in, thick, wet, suffocating. The world disappeared. Even the lake went silent. They waited. On the 3rd day, Scobie climbed again. His flashlight was almost dead. The batteries wheezed with each pulse. He sent the signal anyway. That was when he saw it, a shape on the horizon, faint and small, like a dream. The Coast Guard cutter would rush. He kept flashing until his arm gave out. The cutter drew closer, its hull cutting through the haze, sending a wave of relief that felt unreal. When the rescue boat arrived, the three men were half delirious. Their clothes stiff with soot and salt daubed behind them, the tower still smoked. Inside, rescuers found nothing of William Maxwell. The blast had come from the base, likely a buildup of gas near the generator, and the fire had consumed everything. Maxwell had died instantly. When the Wood Rush left, the lake returned to silence. For the first time in 80 years, no one remained to tend the light, but Standard Rock still stood, blackened, cracked, stubborn as ever. Even after fire, after loss, the tower did not fall. The story of Standard Rock showed how isolation could crush the spirit of men. Yet in another corner of the coast, one woman faced the same storms, not with despair, but devotion. While others counted the hours until relief, she counted the lives she could still save. Her name was Kate Moore, the first woman to stand among the heroes of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. It began on a night no one remembered because no one thought a child could save the sea. The wind came first, sharp, cold, and endless, rolling off Long Island Sound with the weight of 1,000 broken waves. The light at Fairweather Island trembled, its faint glow fighting through the rain. Somewhere in the keeper's house, a 12-year-old girl sat awake, listening to the storm scratch at the windows. Her father, Captain Stephen Moore, had once been strong enough to command ships across the Atlantic. But now, even the act of breathing came in shallow, pained bursts. His hands, once hardened by rope and salt, trembled when he tried to lift the oil can. The light outside, his duty, was dying. Someone had to go. So the girl, Kathleen Moore, took his lantern. She wrapped herself in a wool shawl 2 sizes too big and stepped into the storm. Between the house and the tower stretched a marshy path. 2 narrow planks laid side by side. Tonight they were invisible under 4 feet of freezing tide. Lightning flashed. The sky went white. She could see the tower for a heartbeat. Then nothing. The next step vanished beneath her. She fell, caught herself, felt the water slice into her legs. But she didn't stop. Every gust shoved her backward. Every wave threatened to erase her. She kept the lantern pressed to her chest, its flame sputtering, but still alive. When she finally reached the base of the tower, the door was half frozen shut. She pushed, slipped, and fell inside. The air wire of whale oil and smoke. The spiral stairs wound upward like the inside of a shell. She climbed, counting each step in rhythm with her heartbeat. 78 in all. At the top, the lamps flickered low. The reflectors stirred with soot. She filled them one by one, her small hands trembling from cold. Then struck the flint. The light came back. Faint at first, then steady. It stretched across the black water, sweeping over the waves like a signal of defiance. Out there, beyond the storm, 200 ships waited in the harbor. Some would never know that the reason they survived that night was a girl with salt in her hair and a heartbeat made of fire. When dawn came, the storm was gone. The sea was calm, glassy, deceptive again. And from the mainland, the light on Fairweather Island still shone, bright, rhythmic, alive. That was the night the keeper's daughter became the keeper herself. And for the next 70 years, she would never let the light go out again. Morning came slow to Fairweather Island. The sea turned from iron to glass, and the first light of day revealed what the night had hidden. A world both beautiful and merciless. From the mainland, the lighthouse looked like a postcard, an octagonal tower, a white keeper's cottage, and a small garden surrounded by drifting gulls. But for Kate Moore, it was the edge of the world. a place where days bled into years and silence became a companion, not a punishment. She grew into her duty the way stone grows into salt. Each night she climbed those narrow, spiral stairs with a can of whale oil pressed to her chest. The lamps above took 4 gallons of oil to keep alive, and every few hours she returned to refill them, polish the brass, and wipe the soot from the glass. When the wind howled, she stayed in the tower all night, too afraid the flame would die if she dared to leave. The walk between the cottage and the light never got easier in calm weather. It was a rhythm, boards creaking underfoot, the sea slapping softly against the rocks. In winter, it became a gauntlet of ice where she could barely tell water from sky. Yet she crossed it hundreds of times. When she wasn't tending the light, she tended life. Her own small world of chores and creatures. 2 cows, 20 sheep, and a coop full of chickens were her neighbors. She sheared the sheep herself each spring, spun their wool, and patched her clothes by hand. When storms kept her trapped inside, she carved wooden duck decoys to sell to fishermen. On warmer nights, she'd sit by the oil stove, shaping the wings with her knife, listening to the steady hum of the foghorn echo through the sound. Visitors were rare. Sometimes a fisherman would row ashore with mail or a basket of fruit. Once a doctor and his wife crossed the frozen sound on a sleigh. The only time in 58 years ice had been thick enough to bear weight. Kate laughed when she told that story. "I never thought I'd see horses on the sea," she said. Most nights she was alone, but it was a loneliness she had made peace with. You see, she would later tell a reporter, "I had done this for so many years. I knew no other life, so I was fitted for it." When the sea was calm, she read by lamplight the Bible, ship logs, old letters from sailors who'd written to thank her. When storms came, she slept in her clothes beside the tower. A lantern hung by her headboard so she could watch the reflection of the beacon on the wall. If the light stopped moving, she would wake and run through wind, through rain, through everything that tried to stop her. And there was more than the sea to fear. Fairweather Island was lonely, but not empty. At night, poachers crept along the oyster beds, their boats ghosting through the mist. Kate met them with a shotgun in hand and a voice that could cut through fog. "I represent the United States government," she'd shout. "And you've got to go." No one ever tested her twice. By the 1840s, storms had become part of her vocabulary, the language of survival. She knew the sound of sleet against the glass, the pitch of a wave before it struck the wall, the color of lightning just before the oil flame dimmed. The world might have called her a caretaker, but in truth, she was a soldier fighting a war of wind and water night after night. And through it all, the light never failed. Years passed, decades turned, her parents aged into their 90s, still living under the same roof she'd once shared with them. Her brother Alexander died young, her sister moved away. Kate remained holding the island alone. When visitors asked if she ever thought of leaving, she'd look toward the horizon and say, "Someone has to keep it." By the time the world began to change, by the time steamships replaced sails and electricity replaced flame, she had already lived most of her life by that tower. And yet, no one had ever officially called her its keeper. That title still belonged to her father. By the mid-1800s, Black Rock Harbor was a web of masts and rigging. 200 ships anchored under the stars, their lanterns trembling like fireflies over the sound. To the sailors who passed through, the fair weather light was just another beacon on a familiar horizon. But to those who ever saw its flame through a storm, it was the difference between life and death. And the one who kept it burning was a woman no one expected. When the wind rose, Kate Moore didn't sleep. She'd stand at the window, shawl pulled tight, waiting for the light to vanish in the squall. When it flickered, she'd run to the tower, oil in hand, and climb the 78 steps without stopping. Sometimes she stayed there all night, the flame guttering, her hair stiff with salt. The sound was cruel. There were nights when 3 or 4 wrecks would strike within hours. Schooners and cutters, driven against the reef by invisible currents. When dawn came, she would walk the shoreline, the water foaming at her boots, searching for survivors. She found men clinging to broken planks, men whose faces she'd later have to bury. One winter night, the cries came again, thin, distant, carried through the fog. Kate and her brother Alexander took their rowboat into the darkness. The water was black glass. Every stroke of the oars vanished into mist. For an hour they searched until their lantern caught the glint of wet wood. A capsized boat, 2 men clinging to its keel. She pulled them aboard, her arms numb, her breath raw from cold. One survived. The other died before sunrise. The next morning, Kate wrote in her logbook, 2 men taken from the Sound, 1 lost. Then she went back to the light. That was her rhythm. Save, bury, return. Some nights the sea brought her bodies. Fishermen, deckhands, strangers. She covered them with canvas, waited for the coroner, then walked home past the sheep field, her hands still shaking. And when the foghorn moaned across the harbor, she would look toward the tower, make sure the flames still turned, and whisper, "Not tonight." By her own count, she saved 21 lives, but historians believe the number was higher. 2 more rescues were later discovered in old reports. Men found half frozen, revived under her roof. That brought the total to 23. In another time, another life, it might have made her famous. But fame never came to Fairweather Island. For nearly 50 years, the U.S. Lighthouse Service sent her father's paychecks. Not hers. Every month, the money arrived in the name of Captain Stephen Moore, long retired and barely able to walk. Kate never complained. She did the work because the light was her inheritance, not her job. When her father finally died in 1871 at the age of 98, the government made it official. Kate Moore, now 59 years old, was appointed keeper of the Fairweather Light. By then, she had already outlived storms, wars, and nearly everyone she'd ever known. She'd done her father's job for 47 years without title or pay. Now at last, the sea recognized its truest keeper. Her duties didn't change, only her name in the logbook. Each evening, she still walked the planks, still filled the lamps, still fought the wind. She raised sheep and chickens, milked her cows, mended nets for passing sailors, and shot warning rounds at oyster thieves who dared to approach the reef. Her voice echoed across the waves. "I represent the United States government, and you've got to go." Half defiance, half duty. To the fishermen of Long Island Sound, she became legend. The woman who outlasted the storm. Visitors who came to see her found a woman of quiet grace, hands weathered, eyes bright. The walls of her home were lined with books and carved wooden ducks. Her mother's old Rubens painting hung above the stove. She would greet strangers with tea and stories of shipwrecks, speaking of the dead with reverence, not sorrow. "Some of them were my neighbors," she once said. All of them had someone waiting. When the New York World interviewed her in her later years, they called her the guardian of Black Rock. And though the world had changed, steamships, telegraphs, even electricity, the light she tended was still lit by hand. Still fueled by oil she carried up every night. And every night she looked out at the same black horizon, the same water that had tried to take her hundreds of times, and she kept the flame. By the time Kate Moore reached her later years, she had already spent most of her life at Fairweather Island Light Station, tending the lamp that guided ships into Black Rock Harbor. Connecticut. Kate retired in December 1878 after more than 50 years of service and bought a small house on Main Street, now Brewster Street, near Black Rock Harbor. Her parents had both lived into their 90s. Her brother, Alexander, had died of illness in 1853. She continued to live quietly in Bridgeport. According to city records, she appeared in the 1898 Bridgeport Directory listed as Miss Kate Moore. She died in 1899, reportedly at the age of 85, and was buried in Mountain Grove Cemetery in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Her grave remained unmarked for 115 years until May 8, 2014, when the United States Coast Guard and Bollinger Shipyards placed a marker to honor her service. That same year, a new Coast Guard cutter was commissioned in her name, the USCGC Kathleen Moore. At the dedication ceremony, Vice Admiral Sally Bryce O'Hara called her life a lifetime of service, saying she proved that women performed with distinction. Whether the job at hand was harrowing or dutifully and diligently routine, today, the Fair Island Lighthouse still stands at the entrance to Black Rock Harbor. Though automated long ago, it remains one of the oldest surviving lights on Long Island Sound. And its history still bears the name of the woman who kept it shining for over half a century. Kathleen Kate Moore, one of America's first and bravest lighthouse keepers. Kate Moore proved that a lighthouse keeper's life was not just about enduring storms, but somewhere far across the world, another keeper would prove something different. That this same duty, this same light had helped two souls find each other across 8 kilometers of open sea. The Morse Code. Lovers of South Solitary Island, Australia, 1910-1912. A love written in light. By the early 1900s, lighthouse life meant silence. The wind replaced voices. The sea replaced clocks. On South Solitary Island, 8 kilometers off Coffs Harbor, that silence was absolute. Built in 1880, the lighthouse stood on bare volcanic rock. No trees, no harbor, just white stone and the sound of waves that never stopped. For the men who served there, the isolation was complete. But in 1910, one of them would find something the sea almost never gives: connection. His name was John Harry Pfizer. Barely in his 20s when he became the junior keeper on this remote post. His days were filled with maintenance, scrubbing, polishing, winding the clockwork, watching the lens sweep its slow circle over an endless, empty horizon. His only contact with the mainland came through the signal station at Emerald Beach, where communication was done by flags in daylight and Morse code light at night. Among the keepers ashore was George Damerel, the signal master, and among his children was Ma. She had grown up in the rhythm of flags and lamps, fluent in the alphabet of dots and dashes. At first, their messages were all business. Weather reports, oil requests, supply orders. But the ocean has a way of teaching patience, and patience in turn becomes curiosity. Soon, their transmissions carried more than information. Harry would speak via Morse code. Ma told Harry about herself, and Harry wanted to find out more about this young lady who was single. Each night across 8 kilometers of black water, the 2 lamps blinked back and forth. A conversation visible only to them. A slow, luminous courtship was beginning. Former keeper Rob Triss, a member of the Friends of South Solitary Island Lighthouse, later called it a treasured part of the island's folklore and history. The details came from Ma's own diary and scattered letters. Harry was out there as a single lighthouse keeper, a young fellow. There was no internet, no television. You can imagine being out there. In that loneliness, every flash of light from the mainland became a heartbeat. Every pause in the code held breath. Then one day, Harry decided that light alone was not enough. Using packing crates from the island's supply shipments, he built himself a small wooden boat, rough, handmade, but seaworthy. Harry built himself a small boat out of packing crates that came out to the island and rowed the 8 kilometers across to the beach. Rob recalled, he was a very brave man to do it. He would do it in his day off, and he would have arranged the night before to meet Ma on the beach. He came ashore, soaked and grinning, to find Ma waiting, picnic basket in hand. The two sat on the sand beneath the cliffs of Emerald Beach, the sea still between them and the rest of the world. He came ashore. Ma would prepare a picnic, and romance blossomed over a period of about 12 months. For a year, their secret meetings continued, arranged by flashes across the water, an oceanic rhythm of waiting and reunion. And in 1912, their story reached its perfect conclusion. The romance culminated in the marriage of Harry and Ma in Coffs Harbour in 1912. No one knows exactly how he proposed. What I don't know is, did he propose on the beach or did he propose by signal lamp? Rob said, whichever it was, light carried the message. After the wedding, Ma joined Harry on South Solitary Island. The young couple began their life together, surrounded by sea and ice. A life of storms and solitude, but also profound beauty. They had no electricity. Cooking would have been done in a coal-fired stove, and for refrigeration, they would have kept meat in a safe or in a coal pit up at the house. Days began with sunrise, ended with the turning of the light. They lived to the rhythm of the sea, trimming the wick, checking the weather, listening to whales beneath the rocks, and watching lightning roll across the ranges behind Coffs Harbour. You are up with the sunrise. You turn the light on at sunset. You are there through the night hearing whales under the lighthouse, seeing thunderstorms breaking across the ranges behind Coffs Harbour, the stars. It's a very profound experience. Harry was later promoted to headkeeper, eventually transferred to Byron Bay, and though they never had children, they spent their lives together on lighthouse stations, a marriage built not on wealth or comfort, but on endurance and faith. There's no barrier to love. When people want to find love, they find love. More than a century later, the story endures in records, letters, and the archives of the Friends of South Solitary Island Lighthouse, where it has become part of the island's living memory. We have a series of old pages that we have pulled out. Historically, there is a story about Mooney Creek and the lighthouse and its construction and shipwrecks and Harry and Ma's story feeds in through that, and it permeates in through other documents that we have been able to pull together to try and put together a list of the lighthouse keepers and their stories. This is one of the special ones. It's a story that has transcended time. In March 2024, the lighthouse marked its 144th anniversary. To celebrate, the keeper's descendants gathered as the tower's original optic, the great assembly of glass and prisms that once threw its beam across the Ticini, was lit again for a few brief minutes. In a symbolic marking of the occasion on March 15th, the lighthouse's original optic, the assembly of lenses and prisms used to transmit light, was briefly turned on again. That lens now rests at Coffs Harbour's foreshore, restored and displayed under museum lights. But out on the horizon, South Solitary still stands, empty, wind-beaten, its automated lights still turning as it has since 1880. And on calm nights, locals say, when the sea is flat and the stars are sharp, you can still imagine it. Two lamps blinking across the dark. Dot by dot, dash by dash, a love story still written in the language of light. Leaving behind the love story that shone across the sea, we come to another light. One that doesn't guide the living toward love, but the dead toward home. On the far edge of Long Island, a lighthouse has burned for more than 2 centuries. And every Christmas they say its beam still calls to a name carried by the waves. Abigail, the girl who never truly left Montauk Point Lighthouse. The wind off Long Island carries a strange sound in December. It rises from the surf below Montauk Point, part wind, part wave, and something else entirely. Locals say if you listen long enough, you'll hear a woman calling for help. A voice that has echoed for more than 200 years. Montauk Point Lighthouse stands like a candle at the edge of the continent. The first lighthouse in New York State, commissioned by President George Washington in 1796. Before it was built, British troops had used the high cliffs of Turtle Hill to guide their blockades during the Revolution, lighting watch fires where the lantern now turns dot. Since then, the tower has seen everything: the birth of the nation, the storms of the Atlantic, the footsteps of poets like Walt Whitman and soldiers like Theodore Roosevelt. It has outlasted every war, every hurricane, and every keeper. But one visitor, they say, never left. Her name was Abigail. On Christmas of 1811, a ship bound for New York was caught in a violent storm off the eastern tip of Long Island. The wind screamed through the rigging, and the waves rose like black walls, tearing the vessel apart. Among the passengers was a young woman named Abigail. Some say she was on her way to meet her fiancé. Others say she was fleeing a life she could no longer bear. Whatever her story, she fought her way through the freezing surf, clutching debris from the wreck until she reached the beach below Montauk Point. The lighthouse keepers found her there alive, but barely. They carried her inside, wrapped her in blankets, tried to warm her by the fire, but the sea had already claimed her. Before dawn, she was gone. They buried her near the cliffs, facing the ocean she had tried so hard to escape. But her story didn't end there. In the years that followed, strange things began to happen inside the tower. Keepers on the night shift reported hearing soft footsteps on the spiral stairs when no one else was there. Others spoke of a woman's voice whispering their names, or of the faint sound of sobbing carried by the wind. Visitors sometimes saw a pale figure at the window, looking out to see her dress fluttering through the air was still. Even the Lighthouse's own historian, Henry Osmers, has told of encounters he can't explain. In an interview with Newsday, he recalled 3 separate moments when he felt someone tugging on his shirt while he worked alone inside the tower. There was no one there, he said, but I knew exactly who it was. Osmers believes the shipwreck may have occurred later, perhaps in the late 1800s, but the name, the legend, and the presence remain the same. Staff members have reported furniture moving on its own, picture frames swinging and doors creaking open in the stillness of night. And every December when the sea turns wild again, the activity grows stronger, as if the storm that took a Dale is always trying to return. Montauk's cliffs are steep, and the ocean below is merciless. For centuries, it has been a graveyard of ships and sailors. The HMS Culloden, the John Milton, the Pelican, and dozens more. The locals say that's why the lighthouse glows a little differently on cold nights, because it stands watch not only for the living, but for the lost. Each Christmas Eve, a few residents make the trip up the hill after dark. They bring lanterns, stand by the old stone walls, and listen to the wind. Some swear they've seen a figure walking the cliffs, lantern in hand, the beam flickering like a heartbeat. Others say the light in the tower itself changes color for a moment from white to a faint warm gold just before midnight. Perhaps it's only imagination, or perhaps it's something else. A memory that refuses to fade, a love that never reached shore, a spirit still drawn to the light that failed her once, but never again. Today, the Montauk Point Lighthouse still stands tall on its windswept cliff, 144 feet above the Atlantic. Automated long ago, it no longer needs a keeper. Yet, it feels as though someone is still there, climbing those stairs, watching over the horizon dot, and when the Christmas storms roll in, locals say the beam of Montauk shines just a little brighter, as if calling through the darkness. Come home, Abigail. The light's still on. At the farthest edge of Alaska, where volcanoes guard the horizon and the Pacific meets the Bering Sea, there once stood a tower built to guide ships through the fog. But on one quiet April night in 1946, the ocean rose higher than any tower ever built. This is the story of the Scotch Cap Lighthouse tragedy. 1:58 a.m. April 1st, 1946. The sea was supposed to be calm. Instead, the radio station above Scotch Cap shook like a living thing. Chief Hobson Sanford dropped his book, leapt from bed, and the floor rolled beneath him as if the island itself was breathing. Bottles shattered. Lamps swung on their chains. Then silence. He looked out the window. Below, the white tower of the Scotch Cap Lighthouse still glowed against the black Pacific. Steady, brave, unaware. The foghorn droned its endless note. The same heartbeat it had sounded every night for years. And then it changed. A low, strange roar rose from the horizon. Deep, endless, like the growl of something waking under the sea. The men froze. The roar grew louder, closer, until it became a wall of sound that shook their lungs. Sanford ran to the transmitter, shouting into the mic. Lights extinguished, horn silent. I believe Scotch Cap Light Station is lost. His voice was swallowed by the noise. A white flash tore across the dark, and the ocean came climbing the cliffs, cut to black. Only the wind remained. 12 hours earlier, the sea was beautiful. From the cliffs of Unimak Island, Alaska, the Pacific stretched like steel, flat, silent, endless. The Scotch Cap Lighthouse, gleaming white on the island's southwest tip, flashed every 15 seconds. 3 seconds of light, 12 of darkness. Its rhythm never broke. Unimak was the last edge of the illusion chain, a string of volcanic islands stretching over 200 miles from the Alaskan peninsula toward the east coast of Russia. A natural wall between the Bering Sea to the north and the Pacific Ocean to the south. It was one of the most violent places on Earth. Born from the collision of tectonic plates, its 57 volcanoes forming the northern rim of the Pacific Ring of Fire. For thousands of years, Alut and Onangan peoples had lived and traveled through these islands, hunting seals, fishing, navigating by stars. The first outsiders arrived in 1741, Russian explorers chasing sea otter pelts. A few lonely settlements followed, but the empire was drowning in debt, and Alaska seemed useless. So, in 1867, Russia sold it to the United States for $7.22 million, 2 cents an acre. By the early 1900s, the region's shipping traffic had grown, and with it came danger, fog thicker than smoke, currents strong enough to tear ships in half. The U.S. Lighthouse Service decided that Alaska needed lights, sentinels for the Northern Sea. In 1901, Congress authorized 11 new lighthouses across the territory. The first 2 rose at Sentinel Island and Five Finger Island in Alaska's Inside Passage. The third would stand here at Scotch Cap, marking the entrance to Unimak Pass, the main maritime corridor linking the Pacific and the Bering Sea. Mariners called it one of the foggiest places on Earth. Construction was a battle against nature. Every bid went over budget. Finally, on June 23, 1902, the 665-ton steamer Homer left Seattle loaded with materials, 30 workers, and 1 doctor. It reached Unimak on July 13th, anchoring in a world of cliffs and fog. The crew built through wind and sleet until winter forced them to stop. Work resumed in May 1903, and on June 18th, the first light of Scotch Cap was lit, a fixed white beam shining from a third order Fresnel lens 90 feet above the sea. It cost $76,701, a fortune for that time. The original tower was wooden, octagonal, and fragile. Around it, 3 small dwellings clung to the rock like shells. 5 keepers rotated duty, 4 active, 1 on leave. Because of its isolation, Scotch Cap was an unaccompanied post. No families, no visitors. Only bachelors and widowers could serve here after passing a physical exam to prove they could survive the loneliness. Each keeper served 3 years, rewarded with a 4th year of paid leave. When the U.S. Lighthouse Service merged into the Coast Guard in 1939, the term shortened to 1 year. But still, it remained the toughest posting in the country. Heavy surf made resupply nearly impossible. Ships could not dock. Mail was dropped by plane when the weather cleared. Food was simple but sufficient. Canned meat, flour, coffee, and the storerooms were packed in case the sea cut them off for months. The men hunted birds, read books, played cards, took photographs. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the silence. But the lighthouse mattered. Its beam saved ships every year, even if it couldn't save them all. In 1909, the Columbia, a government supply ship, wrecked nearby. 194 men survived only because they found shelter at Scotch Cap for 2 weeks. In 1930, the Japanese freighter Kushin Maru ran aground during a blizzard. Again, the keepers pulled the survivors from the surf. In 1942, amid the chaos of World War II, the Russian vessel Turk was wrecked in a storm east of Anamak. The rescue ship USS Rescuer struck a reef and sank, killing its third engineer. The Turk's captain was decapitated by a wave that tore the bridge from his ship. 60 survivors reached the lighthouse, fed, warmed, and kept alive for weeks. The station became legend among sailors, a place of salvation at the end of the world. And yet, for all it had seen, nothing could prepare it for what was coming. In 1940, Congress funded a new tower, reinforced concrete, 50 feet tall with a focal height of 110 feet. Its solid white beam flashed 3 seconds every 15, visible for 15 meters. Engineers said it could withstand a century of storms. It would not last 10 years. By March 31, 1946, 5 Coast Guardsmen manned the light. Above them, at the radio station on the bluff, Chief Hobson Sanford and his crew monitored the sea. The night was calm, unnaturally so. When the quake came at 1:30 a.m., no one imagined it would be the last calm they'd ever know. 1:30 a.m., April 1st, 1946. The night was cold and still. Above the sea, the Scotch Cap Lighthouse blinked in its rhythm. 3 seconds of light, 15 seconds of dark, slicing the black horizon. On the hill above, Chief Hobson Sanford was reading in bed at the radio direction station when the first tremor hit. It began as a low groan, a sound deep beneath the floor. Then the entire building started to sway. Books fell. The lamp swung violently. The metal frame of the radio desk shrieked. Sanford jumped up, heart pounding as glass cracked behind him. The shaking lasted 30 seconds, long enough for every man on Anamak Island to wake. When it stopped, silence returned. Heavy, total, almost unreal. Sanford checked his instruments. No power loss, no visible damage. He picked up the receiver and called down to the lighthouse below. The voice that answered, Chief Bosun's mate Anthony Petty, sounded calm but breathless. "Shook us pretty good down here, Chief, but we're fine. No damage. No." The line crackled. Sanford told them he'd check again in an hour. He stepped outside. The air smelled of ice and salt. Above him, the volcano stood motionless. West Dal Peak, Shishaldin, Isanatsky, all sleeping under the thin moonlight. The sea looked perfectly calm, but that calm had weight to it, like the pause between heartbeats. 15 minutes later, 1:57 a.m., the second tremor struck. This one came sharper, like something snapping deep underground. The floor jolted, shelves rattled, a chair toppled. It lasted 15 seconds, then stopped. Sanford's men ran in from the dormitory, half-dressed. "Aftershock," one shouted. "Maybe," Sanford said. "No eruption, no damage." He called the lighthouse again. Petty's voice came back, faint, static-filled dots still holding. "Shook the tower a bit. Light steady." Sanford scribbled a note in the logbook. 1:57 a.m. aftershock, no damage. All men safe. The crew gathered in the recreation room. nervous laughter filling the air. They were used to tremors. This was the ring of fire, after all. Then, at 2:18 a.m. came the sound. At first, it was a hum, low, distant, like the wind through a canyon. But it grew louder, deeper, a pressure more than a noise. The walls began to shake again. But this time, it wasn't the ground. It was the air. Sanford froze. Every hair on his body stood on end. The sound rose from the sea, building like thunder, stacked upon thunder, a roar that swallowed thought. The men ran to the window. Nothing but darkness. Then through the static of the radio came a faint broken message. Light extinguished horn, silent. It was Petty's voice. And then nothing. Outside the roar became a scream. The first blast hit. The entire station jolted as if struck by a freight train. The floor lurched. Papers flew. Water burst through the door, rushing ankle deep across the concrete. "Get to higher ground," Sanford shouted. "Move!" The men stumbled into the night, flashlights cutting through the rain of spray and debris. Behind them, the ocean thundered up the cliffs. A solid wall of water over 130 feet high born from the sea itself. They ran uphill, slipping on wet rock until the sound faded. Then silence again. The air smelled of salt and oil, and something burnt. Sanford turned and looked back. The place where the lighthouse had stood, the white concrete tower, the foghorn, the keeper's quarters was gone. Not damaged, gone. He stood there trembling, realizing what had happened. A tsunami caused by an 8.6 magnitude earthquake 90 miles south, 13,000 feet below the sea. The greatest force the Pacific had unleashed in decades. He wrote later in his log, "Lights extinguished and horn silent. I believe Scotch Cap Light Station was lost." At dawn, the men descended to the shore. What they found was a wasteland. The new lighthouse, built to last a century, had been ripped from its foundation. Concrete slabs were twisted like paper. Steel doors bent backward. The keepers' homes had vanished, leaving only splintered wood and shards of glass scattered among seaweed and fish bones. They searched for survivors. None. Just fragments. A severed foot, part of an arm, a torn boot, a piece of uniform. Sanford stood over the wreckage. The surf lapping quietly as though nothing had happened. 5 men had been stationed there. Petty, Pickering, Colvin, Distra, and Ness. None remained. It was the worst loss of life at any land-based Coast Guard lighthouse in U.S. history. At sunrise, April 1st, 1946, the sea looked deceptively calm. The volcanoes to the north, Westl Shishildin, Isnotsky, stood motionless under a pale sky. There was no sign of what had happened in the dark. Only the smell of salt, oil, and burning lingered on the wind. Chief Hobson Sanford and his men moved carefully down the slope toward the ruins of the lighthouse. What they saw defied belief. Where the white tower had once stood, only its cracked foundation remained. Everything else, the keepers' dwellings, the generator shed, the foghorn, the radio antenna, had been erased as though scooped clean by an invisible hand. The beach below was a graveyard of debris. Concrete, twisted rebar, splintered timber, barrels, and scattered among them the torn remains of uniforms. The new reinforced tower, the one designed to last a century, had been obliterated in less than a minute. Sanford's men searched in silence. Near the hillside, one of them stopped and called out. There, half buried in sand, was a human foot severed clean at the ankle. A few yards away, a scrap of skin and what looked like a kneecap. That was all that was left of 5 men. Chief Boswin's mate Anthony L. Petty, motor machinist mate Leonard Pickering, fireman first class Jack Colvin, seaman first class Dwayne Dykstra, and seaman first class Paul J. Ness. Over the next week, search parties combed the beaches. Only one body was ever found. Paul Ness, identified by his goatee and high cheekbones. The others were gone, likely carried out to the Bering Sea, swallowed by the cold depths beyond Unimak Pass. They buried what they could beside the graves of 2 Russian sailors who had washed ashore 4 years earlier, victims of another storm. Later, the remains were exhumed and sent home to the continental United States. Sanford's log entry that morning read simply, "Visited site of Scotch Cap Light. Tower completely gone. Debris scattered. All personnel lost." The estimated height of the wave, later confirmed by geologists, was 138 feet. It was strengthened by a massive submarine landslide triggered by the earthquake, amplifying its impact before slamming into the coast at full force. By mid-morning, reports began to come in from across the Pacific. The seismic shock from the 8.6 magnitude earthquake had traveled at 500 miles per hour through the sea. 4.5 hours later, it reached Hawaii. At Hello Bay, the ocean drained away, the tide receding unnaturally fast. Curious onlookers walked out onto the exposed seafloor, staring at fish flopping on the sand. Then came the wave. A wall of water rose from the horizon and tore through the city. 159 people died. Nearly 1,000 buildings were destroyed. The devastation was so complete that it would change Pacific history forever. It was this single event, the Scotch Cap disaster and the destruction of Hilo, that convinced scientists the Pacific needed a warning system. 19 years later, in 1965, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, PTWC, was founded in Hawaii, built upon the memory of 5 men who had no warning at all. In the months following the tragedy, a temporary automated beacon was installed on the bluff. The Coast Guard evacuated Sanford's crew by the end of April. A permanent light was built higher up the hill in the early 1950s, modest, uncrewed, mechanical. By 1971, Scotch Cap was fully automated, its human presence gone. Today, only the shattered base of the 1940 lighthouse remains. It lies at the edge of the sea, overgrown with moss and wind-worn stone, the concrete bones of what was once the brightest light in the Aleutians. When storms roll in from the Pacific, waves still crash over the ruins. And locals say that sometimes in the roar of the surf, you can hear a faint low hum, the ghost of a foghorn that hasn't blown in 80 years. The Coast Guard called it a loss in the line of duty. But it was more than that dot. It was the moment the ocean reminded mankind that light, no matter how bright, is still small against the sea. The lights extinguished, the horn silent, and the ocean kept its secret. The ocean had taken the men of Scotch Cap without warning, its silence more violent than any storm. But not every light was claimed by the sea. Some were extinguished by something colder. Human hands, secrets, or greed. And so to understand the cost of keeping a light, we turn east to the quiet iron port of Escanaba, Michigan, on the western shore of Lake Michigan. There, in 1886, a light went dark not from waves or wind, but from a fire that should never have started, and from the mysterious death of Marielle Terry, the woman who refused to let the Great Lakes go dark. Mystery at Sandpoint Lighthouse Lake, Michigan, 1886. On clear nights, the red beam from Sandpoint Lighthouse cut across the frozen harbor like a wound of light. Ships entering Escanaba could see it from 11 miles out, steady, disciplined, unwavering. And behind that light always was a woman. Her name was Mary Louise Terry, and for 18 years she kept that flame alive. While others slept, she climbed the narrow spiral steps every few hours, trimming the wick, polishing the glass, and feeding the flame that guarded the iron port of the world. When Mary and her husband John Terry arrived in Escanaba in 1863, the town was nothing more than a raw settlement at the mouth of Little Bay Den, a crescent of cold water and new ambition. By the decade's end, our docks were rising, Locomotives whistled on T-shore, and Escanaba was transforming into a vital artery of the Great Lakes trade. The Sandpoint Light was ordered to be built at the end of the peninsula to protect that lifeline. John was chosen as its first keeper in 1867, but before he could even climb the lantern stairs, tuberculosis took his life. Mary buried her husband beside the cold lake he was meant to guard. But she didn't leave. Instead, she fought to take his place. Against the wishes of federal officials who doubted a woman could manage the physical demands, Mary gained the support of the townspeople who petitioned Washington until she was appointed as official keeper. She was by every account methodical, unshakably calm, and as one newspaper would later write, a living illustration of the capacity of women to do honest, hard work. In the Great Lakes District, fewer than 3% of all keepers were women. Most had inherited their posts from dead or ailing husbands. But Mary made the post her own. Her logbooks were meticulous. Her brass fittings gleamed, and every night the red glow from her lens marked Escanaba as a port that never slept. Winters were brutal. The lake froze solid for months, wind roaring out of the north until even the tower itself moaned. Ice climbed the walls. In summer, fog would crawl from the water so thick it swallowed sound until only the faint toll of buoys broke the silence. Inside the keeper's house, Mary lived alone. She tended her small garden, polished the lamp, and kept her books, ledgers, property deeds, careful notes about each inspection. She had savings. Land, a measure of independence rare for a woman of her time. When local reporters came to visit, she would laugh off their questions about loneliness. "The light keeps me company," she'd say. By 1883, Escanaba's docks thundered day and night, shipping iron ore to the steel mills of Chicago and Cleveland. It was said you could tell the prosperity of the town by how steady Sandpoint's light burned. Mary was its constant, its quiet sentry. She was 57 years old when the fire came, and no one, neither in life nor in death, ever truly understood what happened in that house at the end of the point. For 18 winters, the light had never failed her until one March night when it failed her back. It began just after midnight. The harbor was still, the air sharp with frost. In the keeper's quarters of Sandpoint Light, Marielle Terry had finished her rounds. The lamp was trimmed, the lens gleamed clean, and the red beam stretched quietly over the frozen waters of Lake Michigan. At 1 a.m., the town of Escanaba lay asleep beneath a thin veil of snow. Then, a shout broke the silence. From the docks, someone saw smoke curling up from the lighthouse. By the time neighbors reached the peninsula, the tower was already burning, its windows glowing orange against the black sky, the wind carrying sparks toward the bay. They called her name, but no answer came. The roar of the fire drowned every sound but its own. When dawn came, all that remained was a skeleton of brick and iron. The spiral staircase of the tower was still standing. Everything else was gone. Somewhere beneath the smoking rubble lay the woman who had kept Escanaba safe for 18 years. At first, they believed it was an accident, the kind that could happen to any oil lamp, any tired keeper. But then the details began to unravel that certainty. Her remains were found not in her bedroom, but in the southeast corner of the building, far from the place she was known to sleep. The south door stood ajar. The bolt still shot forward as if it had been forced from outside, not unlocked from within. And inside the ashes, investigators found something stranger still. Gold coins lying exactly where the cupboard had been. Property deeds only singed, not stolen. Nothing was missing. The town's newspaper, the Escanaba Ironport, wrote that it is easier to believe that the burning of the house and her death is the outcome of a scheme of robbery than to believe it an accident. But even that didn't fit. There was no robbery, no footprints in the snow, no reason at all. Then came the testimony of Boardman Layton, a handyman who had done repairs at the lighthouse the day before. He claimed that the firewood near the furnace had been dangerously hot. When he mentioned it, Mary had only smiled and said, "I expect to be burned out by it someday, but I sleep with one eye open." The words echoed through the town like a curse. Had she known something? Had someone threatened her? Or was it just the weary humor of a woman who had lived too long in solitude, surrounded by oil, flame, and wind? Whatever the truth, no one saw her alive again. By sunrise, the people of Escanaba stood along the frozen shoreline, staring at the blackened ruins that had once guided them home. The red beam that had ruled their nights was gone. The foghorn was silent, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the iron port of the world stood in darkness. By sunrise, the smoke still rose from the ruin. The people of Escanaba gathered silently along the peninsula, their breath freezing in the air dot where the lighthouse once stood. Only the spiral iron staircase remained. Rising from a pile of brick and ash, a skeleton without flesh. At 9 o'clock that morning, probate judge Emo Glazier arrived to begin the inquest. He was a German bee-born Civil War veteran, a man known for precision and discipline, and now faced a scene that looked more like a battlefield than a beacon. The coroner's jury included 6 townsmen: P. Coffey, C.J. Provo, S.F. Edwards, Charles H. Scott, John Lawrence, and Henry McFall, the city marshal and deputy sheriff. Their duty was simple in theory, to determine how the keeper of Sandpoint Light had died. In practice, it was impossible. They sifted through the rubble in silence. Among the ruins, they found a fragment of skull, a few bones, and a small portion of viscera. All that remained of Marielle Terry. What was left of her was carefully lifted and placed in a small box. The fragments were later handed to Sheriff David Sandy Oliver for safekeeping, but the questions only deepened. Why had her remains been found in the southeast corner, far from her bedroom? Had the fire begun there, or had she been dragged there? The jury examined the south door, now warped by heat. Its bolt was shot forward, still in the locked position. Yet, the door had been found, standing open. It didn't make sense. To the men on the jury, it looked less like escape and more like forced entry. Inside the debris, the investigators found property deeds, only charred at the edges. They found gold coins exactly where the cupboard had been. If this had been a robbery, it was one of the strangest they had ever seen. A thief who broke in, killed no one but the keeper, stole nothing, and burned everything else. Then came the witness. Handyman Boardman Layton told the jury that he had worked at the lighthouse the day before the fire. He claimed that when he mentioned the overheated firewood near the furnace, Mary had smiled and said, "I expect to be burned out by it someday." He added almost proudly that she also said she slept with one eye open. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Was Layton inventing this? To place himself as the last to speak with her to shape the story? Or was he telling the truth and Mary had sensed something coming? No one could say. After a full day of questioning, no evidence of robbery or foul play was found. The cause of the fire couldn't be proven. The building had been almost completely destroyed. There was simply too little left. The verdict entered in the court record of Delta County that evening read only, "Cause of death unknown." And that was how the life of Marielle Terry was closed, not with certainty, but with smoke. One juror, Charles H. Scott, later appraised her estate at $3,830 before debts. Her nephew, David Thurston, served as executive, dividing her property among her 8 surviving relatives. A modest fortune for a keeper who attended her light with government pay barely over $500 a year. Outside, the wind came off the bay. The ice cracked faintly along the shore, and the ruined spiral staircase stood untouched. Reaching toward nothing, as if the light had fled upward, leaving only smoke, silence, and questions. In the weeks after the fire, Escanaba moved quietly on. Ships still came and went. Iron still left the docks, and the harbor lights still blinked across the bay. But for a long time afterward, townsfolk swore that Sandpoint never felt the same. When spring thawed the snow that year, the U.S. Lighthouse Service ordered the tower rebuilt. Masons worked through the summer, stone by stone, until by autumn the light was shining again. The same red glow stretching across the harbor, as if Mary herself had lit it. Thought she was gone, but her name remained in every report and every whispered story. A methodical woman, careful in her duties, one newspaper had written. And that was how they remembered her for 53 more years. The rebuilt Sandpoint light guided ships safely through Little Bay Den. In 1939, when the U.S. Coast Guard took control of America's lighthouses, the Escanaba light was finally extinguished and converted into housing for Coast Guard personnel. The roof was raised, the lantern removed, and the tower itself shortened by 10 feet. It might have ended there. Just another decommissioned light along the Great Lakes. But in 1985, when the Coast Guard left Escanaba, locals refused to let it fade. The Delta County Historical Society leased the abandoned building and began the painstaking work of restoring it to its original 1868 condition. By 1990, the red lamp burned again, not to guide ships, but to remember a keeper. Visitors climbing the narrow spiral staircase can see the old fourth-order Fresnel lens polished and shining. On quiet evenings, when the wind shifts off the lake, the house cacks softly, and some say you can hear footsteps pacing the lantern room. The docent will smile when you ask. They'll tell you it's just the wind or the wood settling, but sometimes they'll lean in a little closer and say, "She's still here." Some claim to see her through the glass on winter nights, a faint figure moving past the lantern, tending to a light that no longer needs tending. Others say they felt the temperature drop in the keeper's bedroom, or heard the clink of a brass oil can on the iron stair. Skeptics dismiss it all, but even they paused before leaving, turning once more toward the tower, toward that solitary red beam that once pierced a frozen harbor and outlived the woman who fed it. Mary Terry was never proven murdered. Her death was never proven accidental. And perhaps that's why her story still glows quietly behind the flame. The light at Sandpoint burns again, not as a warning to sailors, but as a monument to every keeper, man or woman, who stood between the lake and the dark. And sometimes, when the snow falls over Escanaba and the red lamp cuts through the fog once more, locals will glance toward the point and whisper, "She's watching the harbor again." Across the coast, far to the east, another light had already begun the story. Before Mary Terry, before Kate Moore, before any woman ever stood watch against the dark, there was Boston Light. It was the first beacon ever raised on American soil. And almost from the moment its flame was lit in 1716, it too became a stage for loss. The first keeper, George Worthy Lake, tended it with his wife and daughter on the lonely rocks of Little Brewster Island. They lived surrounded by the sea. The light, their only company, until the ocean claimed them all. What happened that November morning would become the first recorded tragedy in American lighthouse history? A story so haunting that it inspired a 12-year-old boy named Benjamin Franklin to write his first published work, The Lighthouse Tragedy. And that's where our next story begins. At the birthplace of every light that came after. Boston Light, Boston Harbor, Massachusetts, autumn 1716. Before America had a name, before its coasts were charted and its harbors mapped, there was a single lantern that cut through the dark. The first light ever built on these shores. On a cold September evening in 1716, the tide crept over the jagged stones of Little Brewster Island, a small speck of rock at the mouth of Boston Harbor. Wind hissed through the grass. Gulls wheeled low over the surf. And on the edge of the world, a tall stone tower waited to breathe for the first time. Inside stood George Worthy Lake, a man of 43, broad-shouldered and calm, wearing a dark coat faded by salt and years at sea. At his side was his wife Anne and their daughter Ruth, 15. They had carried oil, trimmed the wicks, and now together they watched the flame catch. When the lantern bloomed into light, the glow reached far across the bay. A soft pulse of gold mirrored in the black water. Ships anchored offshore answered with horns, and Boston's harbor glimmered in reply. That night, history began. Boston Light had come alive. The first lighthouse ever built in North America, Worthy Lake was more than a keeper. Appointed by the General Court of Massachusetts, he served as harbor pilot and warden, guiding ships safely through the narrow channel. His yearly salary was $50, raised later to $70. And to earn more, he kept a small flock of sheep grazing on Great Brewster Island nearby. The family lived alone, save for a man named Shadwell, Worthy Lake's enslaved servant who helped tend the lamps and boats. Together, they formed one of the most isolated households in colonial America, surrounded by nothing but waves, wind, and the ceaseless rhythm of ships entering the harbor. Each evening, the tower burned from sunset to sunrise. Each morning, George climbed the narrow spiral, polished the glass, and recorded in his log the passing of every vessel. The Boston Light Bill of 1715 had ordered this duty for the direction of ships and vessels in the nighttime, bound into the said harbor. And George, the first to bear that charge, carried it with pride. But the ocean gives and the ocean takes. In 1717, a great storm swept across the coast. From the lantern room, George watched helplessly as his sheep, trapped on the long sand spit between Great and Little Brewster, were swallowed by the tide. He buried their bones himself along the dunes, an omen perhaps that the sea would not stop there. For 2 years, the Worthy Lake family kept their post faithfully. Sailors grew used to the beam from Beacon Island, a single point of light marking safety and home. In Boston, merchants toasted the new light as proof that their city had become the heart of American trade. And for a time, all seemed secure. Then came Sunday, November 3rd, 1718. Sunday had been calm, unseasonably so for November. From Little Brewster Island, George Worthy Lake could see the spires of Boston rising sharp against a pale sky. He had trimmed a wick that morning, checked the lantern glass, and made ready for a short trip ashore. The family had business in town to attend church, collect his pay, and buy a few winter stores. By dusk, the sea began to lift again. Low swells rolled in from the east, brushing against the shoss that guarded the harbor mouth. Still, George, his wife Anne, their 15-year-old daughter, Ruth, and 2 men, John Edge, a family friend, and Shadwell, the family's enslaved servant, boarded a sloop bound back toward their island home. Just offshore, they dropped anchor near Little Brewster. The great stone tower stood waiting for them in the dimming light, its lantern dark until nightfall. On shore, another girl, Mary Thompson, Ruth's friend, waved from the sand while the Worthy Lakes' younger daughter, Anne, stood beside her. The group transferred from the sloop into a small canoe. The final few yards between the sea and home dot, it was barely large enough to hold them. The water was cold, the wind sharp. From the island, the girls watched the little craft drift, tilt, then capsize. The canoe flipped without warning. The figures tumbled into the freezing water, flailing as the current dragged them under. The 2 girls screamed. For a moment, they could see faces breaking the surface, hands clutching at the overturned hull, and then nothing. All 5 were lost. 3 days later, the Boston Newsletter, dated November 10, 1718, carried the grim report. On Monday last, the 3 current and awful and lamentable providence fell out here. Mr. George Worthy Lake, master of the lighthouse upon Great Brewster, called Beacon Island. Anne, his wife, Ruth, their daughter, George Cutler, a servant, Shadwell, their Negro slave, and Mr. John Edge, a passenger. Being on the Lord's Day here at Sermon and going home in a sloop, dropped anchor near the landing place, and all got into a little boat or canoe, designing to go on to shore, but by accident overwhelmed it so that they were drowned. The bodies were later recovered and laid to rest together in Copp's Hill Burying Ground in Boston's North End, marked by a triple headstone standing today. For the town, the tragedy was a shock. The first light of the New World had barely begun to shine, and already it had claimed its first keepers. And somewhere in the crowded streets of Boston, a 12-year-old apprentice watched the funeral procession pass. His name was Benjamin Franklin. That night, in his brother's print shop, young Franklin dipped his quill in ink and began to write his first work, a mournful ballad he titled The Lighthouse Tragedy. He sold the song as a handbill in the streets, calling out to passers-by to hear of the sad fate of Mr. Worthy Lake and his family. Years later, Franklin would call it wretched stuff, but in truth, it was history. The first American poem about the sea and the first eulogy for a keeper of the light. By the middle of the 18th century, Boston Light had long since regained its steady rhythm, flashing through fog, guiding ships between the scattered teeth of the harbor islands. Generations of keepers had come, and Sandy's George Worthy Lake. And though storms and salt gnawed at the tower stone, its flame endured. But the calm was ending. The harbor itself was now a battlefield. In July 1775, as the American Revolution ignited, British warships anchored off the coast of Massachusetts and claimed Little Brewster Island. From that lonely perch, the Redcoats used the light not as a guide for trade, but as a lookout, a tool to tighten their blockade around Boston. To the revolutionaries on shore, the beacon that once symbolized safety now burned for the enemy. It had to be silenced. On a moonless night, American troops under Major Benjamin Tupper rowed out across the dark harbor, oars muffled, hearts pounding. They landed at Little Brewster and set the tower ablaze, the flames catching the wooden stairs and lantern room. An eyewitness later described it in words that passed into legend. The flames of the lighthouse ascending up to heaven like grateful incense and the ships wasting their powder. For a brief moment, Boston Harbor glowed red against the night, a light of defiance instead of safety. The British, furious, quickly rebuilt what they could, repairing the stone and re-establishing their signal. But the Patriots returned. On July 31, 1775, 300 men once again stormed the island, driving off the British Guard and burning the lighthouse a second time as they tried to retreat. The tide stranded their boats. British ships closed in, cannon fire raining across the water. American soldiers on the Hull shore answered with a single field gun. It shot landing true and forcing the enemy to break off. The Patriots escaped with only one casualty. General George Washington himself commended their courage, praising their gallant and soldier-like behavior. Yet the light once again was gone. The British lingered for months after they lost Boston, their ships still haunting the harbor. And when they finally withdrew on June 13, 1776, they left behind a final gift of destruction. A time charge that reduced what was left of Boston Light to rubble. Only the scorched stones remained. For 7 long years, Boston Harbor stood dark, its entrance unmarked, its ships guided only by the stars and memory. But when independence came, the light rose again. In 1783, under order of Governor John Hancock, the lighthouse was rebuilt, taller, stronger, and prouder than before. A 75-feet rubble stone tower, lined with brick, crowned by a new lantern. It was, as Hancock decreed, of the same dimensions of the former lighthouse. But its meaning was different now. It was no longer the King's Beacon, it was America's. That year, the first flame since the Revolution was lit, and Boston Light once again shone across the harbor. A symbol not just of safety, but of survival. When the young United States took its first uncertain steps toward nationhood, Boston Light already stood as a witness, the sole survivor of both empire and revolution. In 1789, 6 years after its rebirth, the lighthouse passed from Massachusetts into the care of the federal government, becoming the first navigational aid ever owned by the new republic. It had begun as a provincial tower. Now, it was a national symbol for sailors entering Boston Harbor. Its flame was more than a guide. It was proof that this fragile country, still stitching itself together, could hold fast against wind and war alike. The keepers who followed carried that duty with pride. In 1859, the tower was raised to its present height of 89 feet, lined with brick and crowned with a new 12-sided second-order Fresnel lens, a masterpiece of French engineering that caught and refracted the flame into perfect beams. The mechanism was wound by hand, a clockwork rhythm that needed tending every few hours. If the keeper overslept, the light would falter and ships would vanish into the fog. That same year, a duplex keeper's house was built, and by 1861, the station officially required a head keeper and 2 assistants to maintain it. Each night, one man would climb the narrow spiral, trim the wick, polish the prisms, and watch as Boston slept behind him. And yet the sea was not always kind. The fog that draped the harbor could roll in so thick that ships vanished a few yards offshore. Long before the days of radar, the keepers turned to sound. As early as 1719, Boston Light had been armed with a cannon, America's first fog signal. When the fog swallowed the harbor, the gun was fired into the gray every few minutes, its echo booming across the water. For more than a century, that cannon was the heartbeat of Boston Harbor. It outlived wars, generations, and even the keepers themselves. Eventually, it was moved to Connecticut, and then in 1993, returned by helicopter to its rightful home. Today, it rests once more inside the lighthouse base, its bronze surface dulled by centuries of salt and smoke. Through it all, Boston Light remained constant. When storms erased other towers, when new technologies replaced flame with filament, its lantern continued to turn, tended by men and women who refused to let the oldest American beacon go dark. For more than 280 years, keepers have watched dawn rise over the same rocks that George Worthy Lake once walked. They have climbed the same stairs, heard the same sea, and carried on the same vow to keep the light burning. And so it did longer than any other in the nation. Even as automation swept through the coasts, replacing people with switches and sensors, Boston Light held on. It was not merely a machine of navigation, but a living relic, a place where every rotation of the lens was a heartbeat of history. When the automation order finally came in 1998, it was the last manned lighthouse in the United States. The Coast Guard installed new systems, tested the circuits, and declared it self-sufficient. The final keeper locked the door and stepped away, leaving the lantern to burn on its own. But if you stand on Hull's Point Allerton at dusk, you can still see it. A single white flash every 10 seconds, steady as breath, cutting across the same waves that claimed the Worthy Lakes nearly 3 centuries ago. Boston Light, the first beacon of America and the last to fall silent. After centuries of storms, fires, shipwrecks, and solitude, the stories of these lights have shown one truth. Wherever there is danger, there is always someone or something keeping watch. But if you think you've heard the worst, think again. Because scattered across the oceans are 15 lighthouses so remote, so perilous that even the bravest keepers once called them cursed. Number 15, St. Joseph Lighthouse, Michigan. In summer, it's a postcard. In winter, it's a frozen cathedral. Built in 1832, this octagonal tower at the mouth of the St. Joseph River becomes entombed in ice every year. Its walkway slick and glittering, beautiful from afar, lethal up close. Number 14. Vikerberg Lighthouse, Iceland. Perched on a cliff 7 kilometers off the coast, this tiny red roof beacon stands above crashing Arctic waves. Built in 1939, without helicopters or cranes, workers had to climb the sheer cliff by hand, dragging materials up rope by rope. Today, even with a helipad, fierce winds make every landing a gamble. Number 13. Rubier Knud Lighthouse, Denmark. Once proud on its coastal bluff, this lighthouse nearly drowned in sand. Erosion consumed the land around it until the tower stood half buried, a ghost swallowed by dunes. In 2019, engineers saved it, moving the entire structure 70 meters inland. It's safe for now. Number 12. Kopju Lighthouse, Estonia. The Lean Tower of Sarah. Built in 1933. It once stood 100 meters from shore. Now it stands in the sea. Tilted 15, its base gnawed by erosion. Locals swear that storms sometimes straighten it again, as if the Baltic itself refuses to let it fall. Number 11. Flannan Isle Lighthouse, Scotland. Number 10. Sletnes Lighthouse, Norway. The world's northernmost mainland. Lighthouse built in 1905 on the edge of the Barents Sea. Nazis occupied it during World War II, tried to destroy it and failed. The Arctic wind still howls through its iron stairs. A survivor standing at Europe's frozen crown. Number 9. Teritis Lighthouse, Greece. A marble spiral rising from a needle of stone floating just off Andros Harbor. Destroyed in war. Rebuilt in the 1950s, it became Greece's first fully automated light. Today, it looks like something from a myth. Delicate, impossible, and doomed to crumble if the rock beneath it breaks. Number 8. St. George Reef Lighthouse, California. Built 10 kilometers offshore, it took years, millions of dollars, and several lives to complete. Waves as high as 70 feet smashed its walls, driving workers insane. Locals called it the Cursed Light. In 1975, the Coast Guard gave up. No one would live there again. Number 7. West Pierhead Lighthouse, Ohio. On Lake Erie's calm summer days, it's harmless. But in winter, the wind turns it into an ice fortress. Layers freezing over layers until the whole tower leans under its own weight. One day, it may simply snap off the pier and vanish into the lake. Number 6. Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, Oregon. Number 5. Lageman Lighthouse, France. A lone pillar rising from a single invisible rock off Brittany, where 31 ships sank before it was built. Workers had only 2 hours of calm tide per year to work. For decades, keepers lived surrounded by open ocean, reachable only by zipline from a passing boat. Number 4. Stromboli's Lighthouse, Italy. Built on the lava core of a 200,000-year-old volcano. Barely a kilometer from the living volcano Stromboli itself. Every night, its light competes with the red glow of eruptions nearby. A man-made spark beside the breath of the earth. Number 3. Carillon Lighthouse, France. The Gentleman's Lighthouse, named for Aime Carillon Labaude's ancestor, whose legacy funded its construction. 10 years to build, 1 man dead, and endless waves battering the Fromme Passage. Automated since 2004, it now stands empty. A palace without its king. Number 2. Snake Island Lighthouse, Brazil. A lighthouse in hell itself. Ilha Grande hosts up to 5 golden lancehead vipers per square meter. Snakes so venomous their bite can melt human tissue. Built in 1909 and once staffed by a family, it was soon automated. The snakes have kept it ever since. Number 1. Bishop Rock Lighthouse, England. Just 8,000 square ft of stone when the tide is low, vanishing completely when it's high. Yet here, engineers built a 10-story tower in 1858 after shipwrecks claimed thousands of lives. The first version was destroyed by a storm. This one still stands. Now automated, occasionally used as a private hotel, it remains the most isolated lighthouse on Earth. 15 towers, 15 battles with nature. What lighthouse story do you want to see?